Welcome to another video on stories of our history. Today we are traveling to the very edge of North America, to a place that rewrote the history books overnight. Imagine a wind-scoured meadow on the great northern peninsula of Newfoundland, Canada, at the coordinates 51°35'47" and 55°31'59" W. Here, the Strait of Belle Isle separates the island from Labrador, and the icy Labrador Current collides with the Gulf of St. Lawrence, creating a maritime crossroads that has drawn sailors for thousands of years. In 1960, the Norwegian writer and explorer Helge Ingstad stood on this grassy terrace at a place the locals called aux Meadows, Medusa Bay, named after a French corsair vessel that had once anchored there. Ingstad was not a casual tourist. He was systematically hunting for the physical remains of the Vinland of the Sagas, convinced that Norse seafarers had crossed the Davis Strait and established a foothold somewhere on the North American coast. With the help of local fisherman George Decker, who led him to a series of peculiar overgrown ridges, Ingstad realized he might be staring at the collapsed walls of ancient dwellings. What followed was one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, a fully equipped Norse base camp dating to approximately 1000 AD, half a millennium before Columbus set sail from Palos de la Frontera. The site would eventually yield 8 timber and turf structures, a smithy with a stone anvil and iron slag, and a collection of artifacts that proved beyond doubt that Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, had reached the New World. As we walk through the excavation findings, you will understand how this isolated spot on the Strait of Belle Isle became a hub for boat repair, resource gathering, and exploration, and why it still stands as the only authentic Viking settlement in the Americas. The landscape of aux Meadows is harsh yet strategically brilliant. The shallow waters of Epaves Bay offered a protected landing for shallow draft Norse knarrs and longships, while the surrounding boreal forest of black spruce and balsam fir provided endless timber, a commodity so scarce in Greenland that Eric the Red's colonists risked their lives for it. The site sits on a raised marine terrace about 30 meters from the modern shoreline, a deliberate choice that placed the settlement above storm surges but close enough to haul boats onto the beach. Archaeologically, the cultural layer is sealed beneath a dark, organic-rich soil that preserved botanical remains, charcoal, and the footprints of wooden structures long since decayed. Radiocarbon samples taken from hearth charcoal and worked wood cluster tightly between 990 and 1050 AD. With a calibrated mean around 1021 AD, a date now pinpointed by a cosmic ray event detected in tree rings. This extraordinary precision confirms that the Norse were felling trees and forging iron on North American soil exactly at the moment the sagas say Leif Erikson wintered in Vinland. Even the orientation of the longhouses tells a story. The 3 main halls face roughly east-northeast, their gable ends turned to the prevailing westerly winds, while the smaller workshops huddle behind them, forming a classic Norse farmstead layout that you would find in contemporary Greenland or Iceland. Every detail, from the placement of the doors in the long walls to the thickness of the turf walls, over 1.5 meters at the base, mirrors the building traditions brought west by Norse settlers as they leapfrogged from Norway to the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and finally to America. aux Meadows is not a random campsite. It is a transplanted piece of the medieval Norse world, clinging to a foreign shore by the slimmest of margins. What makes this discovery so emotionally resonant is the way it bridges the gap between parchment and soil. The 2 great Icelandic sagas that mention Vinland, the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red, were written in the 13th century, 200 years after the events they describe. For generations, scholars debated whether they contained any historical core at all, or were simply literary creations blending earlier oral traditions with biblical and classical geography. The Ingstad's excavation transformed those debates by providing tangible, datable, irrefutable material evidence. The very word Vinland had been misinterpreted for centuries. Many assumed it referred to a warm, southern paradise covered in vineyards. But archaeologist Anne Stine Ingstad, who directed the dig from 1961 to 1968 with painstaking Nordic-style methodology, argued that Vin could also mean meadow, or pasture, in Old Norse, a point that fits perfectly with the grassy, sedge-covered landscape of northern Newfoundland. Yet the site also produced 3 butternut shells and a carefully worked piece of butternut wood, a species that does not grow anywhere near Newfoundland, its range being limited to areas south of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, such as New Brunswick. This botanical clue proves that the Norse explored well beyond aux Meadows, sailing into the warmer waters where wild grapes, Vitis riparia, and butternuts truly flourished, exactly as the saga accounts describe. Thus the name Vinland was no mirage. It was an observation recorded by people who had seen both the meadows of the north and the grape-laden woods of the south. The discovery of aux Meadows did not just add a footnote to history, it fundamentally altered our understanding of pre-Columbian transatlantic contact. Before 1960, the mainstream historical consensus held that Columbus's first voyage in 1492 was the moment of sustained Old World-New World interaction. The idea that Norse Greenlanders had been crossing the Labrador Sea for decades around the turn of the millennium was relegated to the realm of amateur speculation. Today, thanks to the meticulous work of the Ingstads and the generations of researchers who followed, we know that the medieval Norse operated a maritime network that stretched from Bergen to Baffin Island and all the way to the tip of Newfoundland. The iron smelted at aux Meadows, dozens of kilograms of slag indicate the first metal production north of Mesoamerica, was forged from bog iron collected in nearby peat bogs. That iron was then turned into rivets and nails for repairing ships, making it possible to extend voyages further south and back to Greenland safely. The site thus represents the pivot point of a daring colonial venture, a staging ground where Norse crews rebuilt their vessels, processed timber and furs, and gathered intelligence before pushing deeper into the unknown. It is a place that shrinks the Atlantic Ocean, reminding us that the Vikings, with nothing but open boats, woolen sails, and superb seamanship, could reach a continent that later empires would claim as a new world. To understand why aux Meadows exists, we must step back into the world of the Icelandic sagas and the tumultuous life of Eric the Red. Around 982 AD, Eric Thorvaldsson, known as Eric the Red for the color of his hair and his violent temper, was exiled from Iceland for 3 years after killing a neighbor in a feud. He sailed west into unknown waters and discovered a vast, ice-covered landmass that he cunningly named Greenland, reasoning that people would be attracted to go there if it had a favorable name. After his exile ended, Eric returned to Iceland and convinced around 25 shiploads of settlers to follow him to the new colony, founding the eastern settlement at what is now Qaqortoq and the western settlement near modern-day Nuuk. This migration took place around 985–986 AD, and among the passengers were Eric's wife Jodhild, their sons Leif, Thorvald, and Thorstein, and their daughter Freydis. The Greenland colony grew to perhaps 2,500 souls at its peak, but it was always a frontier society, lacking wood for building and ships, lacking iron beyond what could be laboriously extracted from bog deposits, and dependent on trade with Iceland and Norway for grain, malt, and luxury goods. Into this world of scarcity came stories of lands glimpsed to the west. According to the saga of the Greenlanders, a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson, blown off course on a voyage from Iceland to Greenland in 985 or 986, sighted 3 unknown coasts, first a land of glaciers and mountains, then a flat, forested shore, then an island with hills. Bjarni did not go ashore. He turned north and eventually reached Greenland, where his reports sparked intense curiosity, particularly from Leif Erikson. Leif Erikson, whom the sagas describe as a large, strong man, of very striking appearance and wise, purchased Bjarni's ship around 999 AD and recruited a crew of 35 men to explore those westward lands. The sequence of his journey as recorded in the saga of the Greenlanders is geographically plausible. He first encountered a barren land of stone slabs he called Helgeland, Slab Land, which almost certainly corresponds to the southeastern coast of Baffin Island or northern Labrador, where flat, glacially polished bedrock dominates. Sailing south and southeast, Leif then reached a flat, wooded coast with white sandy beaches he named Markland, Forest Land, likely the heavily timbered central Labrador coast, today's Hamilton Inlet and Lake Melville area. Finally, after 2 more days at sea with favorable northeast winds, Leif and his crew landed at a place where a river flowed into a lake. The grass grew in abundance, and salmon larger than any they had ever seen teemed in the waters. They built a large house, Leif's booths, and explored the surroundings. One of Leif's men, a German named Turker who had been raised in Erik's household, wandered off and returned in a state of excitement, claiming to have found grapes and wild vines. Turker, speaking in his native German, proclaimed that he was certain because he had been born where there was no lack of grapes. The Norse gathered grapes and cut grapevines and timber, loaded their ship, and returned to Greenland the following spring. Leif named the country Vinland after its natural resources. This is the core narrative, and every physical and paleo-environmental detail we will examine at aux Meadows aligns with it, with the crucial caveat that the base camp was positioned at the northern edge of the explored region, not in the grape-growing zone itself. The second saga tradition, the Saga of Erik the Red, weaves a slightly different thread, combining the voyages of Leif, Thorvald, and Thorfinn Karlsefni into a single grand expedition credited largely to Karlsefni. According to this version, Leif still discovered Vinland during an accidental visit, but the real colonization attempt was led by the wealthy Icelandic merchant Thorfinn Karlsefni and his wife Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, a woman of remarkable courage who would later travel all the way to Rome on pilgrimage. Karlsefni set out from Greenland with 3 ships, about 160 men and women, livestock, and provisions, determined to establish a permanent settlement. After overwintering at Leifspear, the group encountered native peoples the Norse called Skrælings, a term applied to both the Dorset Paleo-Eskimo and Thule ancestors of the Inuit in Greenland, and likely to the ancestors of the Beothuk or other Algonquian-speaking peoples in the Newfoundland area. Trade initially occurred. The natives wanted red cloth and milk, while the Norse desired furs. But a misunderstanding involving a bull that frightened the Skrælings led to a violent confrontation. Several Norse were killed, including Thorvald Eriksson, Leif's brother, who was wounded by an arrow and buried in Vinland. After 2 winters, the threat of further hostilities, combined with internal discord and the sheer distance from support, caused Karlsefni to abandon the settlement and return to Greenland. This saga version, with its larger cast and dramatic battle, reflects the real challenges that the archaeological record hints at. aux Meadows was occupied for only a few years, perhaps no more than a decade, and the Norse ultimately chose to leave rather than commit to a permanent foothold. The causes of that retreat, resistance from indigenous peoples, logistic vulnerability, and a small population base back in Greenland, are written between the lines of the sagas and in the thin occupation layer at the site. Academic skepticism toward the Vinland sagas was deeply entrenched until the 20th century. In the late 1800s, scholars such as Gustav Storm in Norway argued that the sagas contained a kernel of truth but that Vinland must have been somewhere along the New England coast, perhaps Rhode Island or Massachusetts, where wild grapes are abundant. Others placed Vinland as far south as Florida, reading wishful climatology into the descriptions of warm winters. In the United States, the Vinland hypothesis was sometimes entangled with nationalist pride, with some proponents claiming that the Norse had built stone towers like the Newport Tower in Rhode Island or left runic inscriptions like the Kensington runestone in Minnesota, all of which have since been conclusively debunked as hoaxes or colonial-era structures. Such dubious claims made serious historians wary of the entire topic. Meanwhile, Canadian historians and geographers like William Thalbitzer and V. Tanner pointed to the Strait of Belle Isle area as the most logical location for a Norse landing based on sailing distances, currents, and resource availability, but no physical evidence existed. Helge Ingstad's genius was to ignore the wilder theories and focus purely on the most parsimonious reading of the sagas combined with a deep knowledge of Norse settlement patterns. He reasoned that a Vinland base had to be located at a narrow maritime choke point, with easy access to both the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the open Atlantic, with beaches suitable for landing boats, and most importantly, within a region where the Norse would have encountered both the slab land of Helgeland to the north and the Great Bering Woodlands to the south. The great northern peninsula of Newfoundland met every criterion, and Ingstad spent years exploring its coast before he walked into aux Meadows and saw what generations of fishermen and farmers had overlooked. the unmistakable outline of a Norse longhouse. The long search for Vinland began centuries before Ingstad's journey. As early as 1075, the German chronicler Adam of Bremen, writing in his Gesta Hammerbergensis Ecclesi Pontificum, reported that King Sweyn II of Denmark had told him of an island called Vinland in the Western Ocean where grapes grew wild and wheat was self-sown. Adam's account, derived from reliable Norse informants, was the earliest written reference to Vinland outside of Scandinavia and placed the land firmly in geographical consciousness. Later, in the 12th century, the Icelandic geographer included Vinland in descriptions of the world's regions, and by the 13th and 14th centuries, a few scattered references appeared in Icelandic annals, most notably the mention of a voyage to Markland for timber in 1347 by a Greenland ship driven off course to Iceland. After the decline of the Greenland colony in the 15th century, however, knowledge of the lands to the west faded into legend. The Renaissance rediscovery of the Sagas, particularly with the publication of the Old Norse texts in the 17th and 18th centuries by scholars like Thormodus Torfaeus, reignited interest. Torfaeus, an Icelandic historian living in Norway, published Historia Vinlandi Antiqui in 1705, the first comprehensive attempt to map the saga geography onto the New World. He correctly identified Helgeland as Labrador and Markland as Newfoundland, placing Vinland somewhere along the coast of what is now Nova Scotia or New England. His work was read by colonial American intellectuals such as Cotton Mather, who entertained the idea that the Norse might have been the first Europeans in America, but without archaeological proof it remained a matter of speculation and literary curiosity. Throughout the 19th century, the Vinland quest became a cultural phenomenon on both sides of the Atlantic. In 1837, the Danish scholar Carl Christian Raffen published Antiquitates Americani, a lavishly illustrated volume that presented the sagas, translations, and a series of alleged Norse artifacts and inscriptions from North America, including the Dighton rock petroglyphs in Massachusetts and the aforementioned Newport Tower. Raffen's book electrified the public and stimulated a wave of amateur Viking hunting, but its willingness to accept almost any anomalous stone structure as Norse undermined scientific credibility. Meanwhile, the Norwegian polar explorer Fridtjof Nansen, a rigorous scientist, published In Northern Mist in 1911, in which he dissected the sagas and concluded that Vinland could not have been more than a transient campsite, if it existed at all, and that the grape descriptions might be based on wishful thinking or confusion with currants and gooseberries. Nansen's skepticism carried great weight. Yet the sagas persisted in the imagination of the North Atlantic communities. In Iceland, the stories of Leif and Gudrid were foundational national narratives, taught to children as literal history. In Norway, the memory of the Norse seafarers was a source of national pride during the country's struggle for independence from Sweden, which ended in 1905. Among the Inuit and First Nations of Labrador and Newfoundland, oral traditions spoke of pale strangers who had come from the sea long before the arrival of later European fishermen. These cross-cultural threads kept the possibility of a real Vinland alive, waiting for the right investigator to pick them up and follow them to the ground. Helge Ingstad was that investigator. Born in Meråker, Norway, in 1899, Ingstad trained as a lawyer but abandoned the legal profession for a life of exploration and writing. He spent the 1920s and 1930s living among indigenous communities in Canada's Northwest Territories, hunting and trapping, and writing best-selling books about his experiences, including The Land of Feast and Famine. He thus developed an intimate knowledge of the Canadian wilderness and a deep respect for its first inhabitants. During World War II, Ingstad served as governor of Erik the Red's land in East Greenland and later worked as a relief administrator. After the war, he met the much younger archaeologist Anne Stine Ingstad, who had excavated Viking Age sites in Norway and brought to their partnership the scientific rigor of modern Scandinavian archaeology. The couple married in 1941. And by the late 1950s they were actively planning a systematic search for Vinland. Ingstad began by combing through the sagas word by word, marking every geographical clue, the number of days of sailing, the direction, the description of the coastlines, the presence of salmon rivers, the mention of butternuts and grapes. He then studied the sailing routes of medieval Norse ships, using the experimental voyages of the replica ship, Viking, that had sailed from Norway to the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, as well as more recent data on North Atlantic currents. By 1960, he had narrowed his search area to the coasts of Labrador and Newfoundland, and in the spring of that year he traveled by fishing boat and on foot through dozens of outport communities, asking the same question: had anyone seen old house ruins that looked unusual, not like the rectangular stone foundations of later European settlers? The moment of contact between Ingstad and local knowledge came at the tiny fishing settlement of aux Meadows, near the northernmost tip of Newfoundland. There, a fisherman named George Decker took Ingstad to a grassy area overlooking Epaves Bay and pointed out a series of ridges and hummocks that the locals called the Old Indian Camp. The ridges, about 3 feet high and covered in dense turf, formed a rough rectangular outline with a bulge at one end, and to Ingstad's trained eye, they looked utterly unlike the round or oval dwellings of the maritime Archaic or Dorset cultures that had used the area thousands of years earlier. They were, in his words, exactly like the foundation walls of Greenland's Norse longhouses. He and Anne Stine began a small test excavation that summer, and almost immediately, at a depth of just 20 centimeters, they hit a cultural layer containing charcoal, iron slag, and a single small bronze object that made Anne Stine's hands tremble. A ring-headed pin of the type used to fasten a man's cloak, identical to pins from Viking Age Dublin and Hedeby, dating to the 10th and 11th centuries. The following year, Anne Stine Ingstad led the first full-scale excavation with a team of Canadian, Norwegian, and Swedish archaeologists, and over the next 7 seasons, until 1968, she meticulously uncovered the entire settlement, recording every artifact, every post hole, every faint stain in the soil, while Helge managed logistics and communicated the findings to an astonished world. The pin alone was enough to secure initial acceptance, but the team would soon find far more. The excavation at aux Meadows was a masterpiece of mid-20th century field archaeology, blending the Norse turf-building expertise of Anne Stine Ingstad with modern stratigraphic methods. The team divided the site into a grid of 5-meter squares, stripped the overlying peat and topsoil by hand, and carefully exposed the dark stains of the original cultural layer. Immediately, the clarity of the layout stunned them. The settlement consisted of 8 timber and turf structures grouped into 3 complexes, each anchored by a large dwelling hall with a central hearth and a smaller adjacent building, plus 2 additional workshops and a smithy situated on the western edge. The 3 dwelling halls were of classic Icelandic Greenlandic design, bow-shaped longhouses with gently curving outer walls, oriented to provide shelter from the wind, with thick turf and sod walls reinforced by internal timber frames. The largest, known as Hall A, measured an impressive 28.8 meters in length and 15.6 meters at its widest point, with an interior floor area of approximately 250 square meters. Large enough to house 50 to 80 people comfortably. Hall B was 20.4 meters long, Hall C 19 meters, and the smaller structures ranged from 12 to 15 meters. The living floors were covered with compacted earth and sand, and in the center of each hall, running longitudinally, lay a long, stone-lined hearth flanked by raised earthen benches that served as both seating and sleeping platforms, precisely as seen in the famous Brattle farm of Eric the Red in Greenland's eastern settlement. The hearths burned continuously during the cold North Atlantic summers, and the thick charcoal lenses the archaeologists excavated contained fragments of burnt bone from seals, caribou, birds, and fish, providing a detailed menu of the Norse diet at the site. Around and between the halls, the team discovered a series of carefully constructed drainage ditches lined with flat stones, designed to carry rainwater away from the footings and prevent the turf walls from becoming waterlogged. This engineering detail alone pointed to a sophisticated understanding of the local environment and the intention to keep the buildings serviceable for more than one season. The walls themselves had collapsed inward over the centuries, creating the characteristic ridges that first caught Ingstad's eye. When the excavators sectioned the wall tumble, they found alternating layers of turf cut from the ancient peat bogs, intermixed with slabs of birch bark that had acted as a moisture barrier, a technique well documented in the Norse colonies of Greenland but never before seen on this side of the Atlantic. Post holes marked the locations of vertical timbers that had supported a roof likely made of wooden rafters, a framework of branches, and another thick layer of turf, making the halls appear from the outside as low, green mounds that would have been virtually invisible from the sea. The choice of timber was dictated by availability. The main structural elements were spruce and fir, cut with iron axes from the surrounding forest, while smaller components used birch and alder. Tree ring analysis by dendrochronologists decades later would show that the wood was felled in a series of episodes across a few years, consistent with a short-term occupation, and that all the wood came from the immediate vicinity of aux Meadows itself, confirming that the buildings were constructed on site, not brought from Greenland. The roofing timbers showed no signs of reuse, suggesting they were freshly cut for this specific settlement. Everything about the construction pointed to a planned expeditionary base, built with the same care that went into a permanent farm in Greenland but destined to be occupied only briefly. The smithy, located about 20 meters east of Hall A, was the first ironworking facility ever found in the Americas north of Mexico. It was a sunken feature building, dug about 40 centimeters into the earth with turf walls rising above it, measuring roughly 2.9 by 3.5 meters. Inside, the archaeologists found a flat stone that had served as an anvil, surrounded by hundreds of iron fragments, hammer scale, and at least 18 kilograms of slag, the byproduct of smelting iron from local bog ore. Nearby lay a carefully constructed charcoal burning pit where the Norse had produced the high carbon fuel necessary to reach the 1,200 to 1,300 degrees Celsius required to smelt iron. The ore source was identified as a bog about 2 kilometers to the south, where the team tested the peat and found it rich in limonite, a hydrated iron oxide that precipitates in acidic, waterlogged environments. The Norse had dug up nodules of this bog iron, dried and roasted them to drive off moisture, and then smelted them in a small clay-lined furnace built directly on the floor of the smithy. A tuyere fragment, the ceramic tip of a bellows, showed that double-bag bellows made of animal hide had been used to force air into the furnace, exactly as depicted in Norse artwork of the period. The resulting iron blooms were then heated and hammered on the stone anvil to expel impurities and shape them into bars, rivets, nails, and possibly small tools. The amount of slag indicates that several smelting campaigns were carried out, producing enough iron for hundreds of boat rivets, a quantity that makes sense only if the principal activity at aux Meadows was ship repair. A number of the iron rivets found across the site were clenched rows typical of Norse clinker-built vessels, and some had been driven out and discarded, exactly as you would see if old, leaky planks were being replaced with new ones. This is direct, industrial-scale evidence of a maritime maintenance facility 500 years before any European shipyard existed in the Americas. The distribution of artifacts across the site painted a vivid picture of daily life and gendered activities. In the dwelling halls, particularly near the hearth and the sleeping benches, the team recovered a wealth of soapstone fragments, including a nearly intact spindle whorl, the flywheel of a drop spindle used to spin wool into thread. Soapstone, or steatite, does not occur naturally in Newfoundland. The raw stone had to have been brought from Greenland or from the soapstone quarries in Labrador's Nain province, a 500-kilometer sea journey. The spindle whorl is significant because it implies that women were present at the settlement. Spinning was quintessentially women's work in Norse society, and that the group intended some degree of textile production, whether for repairing sails or making clothing. Similarly, the discovery of a small, carefully shaped whetstone of Norwegian schist, worn concave from sharpening metal blades, and a bone needle fragment tell us that both metalworking and textile work were integrated into the daily routine. In the smithy area, the artifact assemblage was dominated by metalworking debris, but among the slag the team also found a small fragment of a bell bronze balance scale pan, an object used for weighing precious metals, possibly silver, which hints at trade or the testing of metals brought back from exploration. Near Hall C, a delicate bronze ring-headed pin, identical in form and alloy composition to pins from Dublin's Viking excavations and from Jarlshof in Shetland, lay where it had been dropped on the floor. This pin was not just a functional object, It was a marker of status and style, linking the inhabitants of aux Meadows directly to the aristocratic Norse world of the North Atlantic, and its presence at a remote Newfoundland site encapsulates the astonishing reach of the Viking diaspora. Each artifact, no matter how small, is a thread connecting this grassy terrace to the bustling harbors of Norway, Iceland, and Ireland. Radiocarbon dating transformed aux Meadows from a compelling set of ruins into an immovable chronological anchor for pre-Columbian transatlantic contact. The first charcoal samples taken from the hearths of Hall A and the smithy were sent to the National Museum of Canada's Radiocarbon Lab in 1962, and the results came back with calibrated age ranges centering squarely around 1000 AD. The earliest dates, processed from hearth charcoal at the bottom of the cultural layer, cluster between 975 and 1020 AD, while dates from upper levels extend to around 1060 AD, suggesting an occupation spanning a generation at most, perhaps only a few years. Over subsequent decades, additional samples of carbonized wood, twigs, and bone collagen were analyzed by multiple laboratories using increasingly precise techniques, including accelerator mass spectrometry, which requires mere milligrams of material. The weighted mean of more than 50 radiocarbon dates converges on 1014 plus or minus 15 years AD for the main occupation phase. This dating harmonizes perfectly with the saga chronology, which places Leif Erikson's initial discovery just after the year 1000, followed by Thorvald's voyage around 1004-1005, and Thorfinn Karlsefni's larger expedition around 1010-1015. It also aligns with the known construction dates of the earliest churches and farms in Greenland's eastern settlement, where dendrochronology of preserved timbers indicates a building boom around 990-1000 AD as the colony expanded and began sending out exploration ships. The convergence of saga narrative, radiocarbon, and archaeology at the turn of the millennium is so tight that it effectively eliminates the possibility that the site is misattributed to other cultures or periods. The absolute clincher for the exact year of Norse presence came in 2021, when an international research team led by Margot Quidams and Michael D. applied a revolutionary dating technique involving a cosmic radiation event. In the year 993 AD, a massive solar proton storm, likely the largest in the last several thousand years, caused a sudden spike in atmospheric carbon-14, which was absorbed by trees worldwide and preserved in their annual rings. By analyzing the tree rings of wood fragments from aux Meadows, including a worked piece of fir and a juniper branch cut with a metal blade, the team identified the 993 anomaly as a distinct marker. They then counted the tree rings outward from that marker to the wane edge, the bark surface, of the wood. In 3 separate pieces of wood, the bark edge was precisely 29 growth rings after the 993 ring, yielding a felling date of 1021 AD. This result, published in the journal Nature, constitutes a pinpoint astronomical date for the Norse presence at the site, independent of any assumptions about artifact typologies or saga chronologies. The wood came from different trees and was associated with different structures, indicating widespread activity in that exact year. The year 1021 thus becomes the first hard, absolute date for European contact with the Americas, 471 years before Columbus's first landfall. It also confirms that the Norse were actively cutting timber and maintaining the settlement in the exact period when the sagas describe Karlsefni's attempted colonization, and it opens the tantalizing possibility that other dendrochronological samples from this region may reveal additional Norse cut wood extending both earlier and later. Building on the absolute date, palynological and entomological studies have fleshed out the environmental conditions of the Norse century at aux Meadows. Pollen cores extracted from the peat bogs adjacent to the settlement show a distinct change in vegetation associated with human impact. Around 1000 AD, charcoal particles spike in the sediment, indicating increased fire activity likely due to the Norse clearing land and operating smithy forges. Pollen from grasses and sedges increases, while tree pollen from black spruce and balsam fir declines, reflecting the opening of the forest canopy to build structures and to gather firewood and ship repair timber. The pollen of plants associated with human disturbance, such as sheep sorrel, chickweed, and nettles, appears suddenly in the cores and persists for a few decades before declining again, evidence of a short-term human presence that left a biological signature but did not permanently transform the landscape. Insect remains, particularly fossil beetles and flies recovered from the cultural layer, reinforce this picture. The beetle assemblages include species that thrive in areas with decomposing animal waste and in dung-rich substrates, pointing to the presence of livestock. Perhaps a few cows, sheep, or goats that provided milk, meat, and wool. The dung beetles are of Eurasian origin, not North American native species, confirming that the Norse had brought animals with them, just as Karlsefni's saga describes the attempt to establish a self-sufficient farm with livestock. The peat cores also contain microscopic egg cases of human-associated parasites, which would have been deposited in the midden areas behind the longhouses, giving a grim but authentic glimpse of the inevitable sanitary challenges of a crowded Viking Age settlement. The metal analysis of the iron artifacts provides yet another independent line of evidence that the settlement was Norse and that its occupants were technologically distinct from all indigenous American cultures of the time. The iron rivets, nails, and tool fragments excavated at aux Meadows were analyzed by metallographic and electron microprobe techniques at the Canadian Conservation Institute and the University of Oslo. The composition reveals a low-carbon iron with a high slag content and a characteristic layered, fibrous structure typical of the bloomery smelting process that Scandinavians had perfected over the previous 1,000 years. There is no arsenic, tin, or other alloying elements that would indicate North American copper or copper-based iron. The metal is purely bog or iron of the type found in Greenland and Iceland. The presence of martensitic and bainitic microstructures in some of the work pieces indicates that the smith deliberately heated and quenched the metal to increase hardness, a technique requiring a sophisticated understanding of metallurgy that no indigenous groups in the region possessed at that period. These findings are crucial because they independently refute any notion that the site represents a Dorset Paleo-Eskimo or ancestral biotic settlement that happened to use iron obtained from trade. The indigenous cultures of Newfoundland and Labrador in the 11th century were hunters of marine mammals, caribou, and fish, who used stone, bone, antler, and ivory for their tools, with no evidence of iron smelting or iron forging. The technology gap is absolute, and the smithy at aux Meadows stands as a pristine example of medieval European industrial technology transplanted onto a new continent. The layout and architecture of aux Meadows speak volumes about the social organization and purpose of the expedition. The settlement was not a random cluster of shelters. It was a deliberately planned installation that mirrors the hierarchical farmsteads of Viking Age Greenland. The three large halls, each with its associated smaller structure, likely housed the three ship crews that the sagas describe: Leif's original crew, Thorvald's, and Karlsefni's, or a rotating complement of explorers. The scale of the halls is disproportionate to a single family's dwelling and far too large for a mere scouting party. Hall A, the largest, has a floor area that could accommodate up to 80 people sleeping on the benches, along with storage for provisions. The presence of a separate cooking pit and a large midden containing butchered animal bones adjacent to the hall suggests that food preparation was done communally, possibly with designated cooks, similar to the organization of a Norwegian royal farm or a ship's crew at its winter quarters. The three-part spatial division corresponds intriguingly to the three distinct social units mentioned in the sagas: the freebooter explorer crew under Leif, the ill-fated hunting party under Thorvald, and the full-scale colony under Karlsefni and Gudrid. Although we cannot assign specific halls to specific saga characters, the very fact that the settlement is tripartite and built all at once, as the contemporaneity of the tree-ring dates proves, suggests a cooperative venture among multiple chieftains rather than a single isolated family. The construction materials themselves reflect a deep adaptation to the local environment, while preserving Norse building traditions. The turf walls, averaging 1.5 meters in thickness at the base, were built by cutting sod blocks from the surrounding peatland, each block measuring about 45 centimeters long, 30 centimeters wide, and 10 centimeters thick. These were stacked grass side down in alternating courses, creating a herringbone pattern that gave the walls structural integrity and insulation. The outer face of each wall was typically battered, sloping slightly inward, while the inner face was vertical, a method that distributed the weight of the massive roof and reduced the risk of collapse. Inside, the walls were lined with vertical wooden planks or wattle panels, set into a foundation trench and secured by posts driven deep into the subsoil. The roof was supported by 2 rows of interior posts, creating a nave and aisle layout reminiscent of a staved church, with the central aisle open to the rafters and the side aisles forming the sleeping and storage areas. The roofing turf, laid over a layer of birch bark and supported by rafters of spruce logs up to 6 meters long, could weigh several tons, and the entire structure depended on the tensile strength of the internal wooden frame. The collapse of the roof and the subsequent decay of the timbers created the distinctive mound profiles that Ingstad recognized. The architectural details, the side aisles, the central hearth, the stone-lined drainage ditches, the use of birch bark as a damp-proof course, are so specifically Norse that they could be matched to known Icelandic longhouses at Stong and to the Greenlandic farm at Garden under Sandet at a level of structural minutiae. No indigenous North American culture built anything remotely resembling this. The contrast with the conical wigwams or multifamily longhouses of the Beothuk is total. The spatial organization of activities around the halls reveals a community intensely focused on maritime tasks. To the east of Hall A, the smithy and a charcoal burning area occupy a zone clearly separated from the domestic halls, likely for fire safety and the control of smoke. Between Hall B and Hall C lies an open yard area where the archaeologists found a concentration of iron boat rivets, many still attached to fragments of decayed wood, suggesting that this was the primary boat repair area. The Norse would drag their ships up onto the gravel beach of Epaves Bay at high tide, dismantle damaged strakes, and carry the planks to the repair yard, where smiths forged new rivets and carpenters shaped replacement timbers. The rivets found scattered across this yard are of a type specifically designed for clinker-built hulls. They consist of a flat-headed nail hammered through overlapping plank edges and then clinched over a small square rove, a metal washer, on the inside, creating a watertight yet flexible joint. Over 100 such roves and rivets have been recovered, many showing signs of having been hammered flat and reused, indicating repeated repair cycles. The presence of both freshly made rivets and worn, discarded ones shows that the smiths were producing new fastenings while also recycling old metal, a practice entirely consistent with the iron-scarce economy of the Greenland settlements. The boatyard area also contained fragments of worked spruce that appeared to be offcuts from reshaping oars and spars, as well as a piece of a steering or yoke, the fitting that attached the side-mounted steering board to the hull, a quintessentially Norse maritime artifact. The totality of these finds demonstrates that aux Meadows was, above all, a ship station, analogous to the later Basque whaling stations on the Labrador coast, except operating with medieval Norse technology 500 years earlier. The symbolic and ritual aspects of the settlement are harder to read in the archaeological record, but subtle clues survive. In Hall C, in a small depression near the northern bench, the excavators discovered a carefully placed deposit of butternut shells and charcoal sealed by a flat stone, possibly a foundation offering meant to bless the dwelling. Such foundation deposits, often containing food, coins, or animal bones, are known from Viking Age houses in Scandinavia and the North Atlantic colonies, and they reflect a blend of Christian and pre-Christian beliefs that persisted in Norse culture well into the 11th century. The butternuts themselves, imported from at least 400 kilometers to the south, had value far beyond their nutritional content. They were exotic trophies from the fabled Vinland itself and may have held talismanic significance. The stone oil lamp found in Hall A, carved from local grey sandstone but faithfully copying the form of soapstone lamps used across the Norse world, would have been the source of light and warmth during the long dark winters, and in a society that had only recently begun to convert to Christianity, the communal lamp may have been the symbolic heart of the hall, akin to the eternal flame of a temple. The small whetstone, once smoothed by sharpening metal tools, was found in the smithy but likely moved between that workspace and the domestic area, and such a mundane object often carried personal meaning for its owner, serving as a link to the home farm in Greenland. The overall impression is of a community that, even in the most distant outposts, maintained the ritual and domestic rhythms of the Norse world, the preparation of food at a central hearth, the spinning of wool by women in the light of a stone lamp, the repair of weapons and tools at the forge, and the careful disposal of exotic offerings under the floor. All within a built environment that was an exact architectural echo of home. The iron smithy at aux Meadows is the single most revolutionary archaeological feature of the site, because it proves beyond any doubt that the Norse not only visited America but carried with them the full technological package of medieval European civilization and deployed it on the new continent. The smithy building, designated Structure J, was a small, semi-subterranean turf-walled hut, its floor dug 40 centimeters into the glacial till to create an even working surface and to keep the intense heat of the furnace contained. Inside, the excavators found a circular, clay-lined furnace base about 30 centimeters in diameter, surrounded by a dense scatter of iron slag, charcoal, and burnt clay fragments. The furnace was a simple shaft furnace of a type well known from Viking Age Norway, built by digging a shallow pit, lining it with a mixture of clay and sand, and constructing a low chimney of stones and clay above it. A tuyere, the blowhole for the bellows, was set into the furnace wall near the base. The bellows were of the double bag type that Norse smiths had used for centuries. 2 leather bags connected to a common nozzle, operated alternately by a smith's assistant pressing down on wooden paddles, delivering a continuous blast of air that raised the temperature inside the furnace above the 1250 degrees Celsius needed to reduce iron oxide ore to metallic iron. The iron ore itself was bog iron, collected as small nodules from the nearby bog and roasted over an open fire to crack the nodules and remove water, a process that produced a recognizable roasted or scatter found near the bog's edge. Once smelted, the iron formed a spongy, porous mass called a bloom, mixed with slag. The bloom was then reheated in the forge fire and hammered on the stone anvil, squeezing out the remaining slag and consolidating the iron into a solid, workable bar. This process was the very definition of advanced pyrotechnology, and it left a signature: hammer scale, slag, and furnace fragments, so distinctive that it could only have been made by trained Norse metalworkers. The smithy was the anchor of the entire expedition, because without the ability to make and repair iron tools and fastenings, the Norse ships could not be kept seaworthy for the long return journey to Greenland. Analysis of the slag from aux Meadows provides extraordinary detail about the iron-making process. The slag can be divided into tap slag and smithing slag. Tap slag is the waste that flows out of the smelting furnace during the bloomery process. It is vitreous, often with flow textures, and at aux Meadows it forms large, dense blocks with a glassy black surface. Chemical analysis of this slag using X-ray fluorescence spectrometry reveals that the ore contained iron oxide levels of around 60 to 70%, with silica, alumina, and lime making up the remainder, a composition entirely consistent with bog iron ores from the Canadian Shield. The smithing slag, by contrast, consists of small, flat, scale-like flakes called hammer scale, as well as plano-convex cakes formed on the floor of the forge as the smith hammered the bloom. The sheer volume of slag, over 18 kilograms recovered from an excavation that focused mainly on the smithy's immediate floor, implies a production run of several blooms, each yielding perhaps 1 to 3 kilograms of usable iron. Calculations by archaeometallurgists suggest that the Norse produced at least 10 to 15 kilograms of finished iron at the site, which would be sufficient to manufacture several hundred rivets and nails, as well as a small number of tools such as adze blades, knife blades, and possibly nails for boat planking. The rivets themselves, when examined microscopically, show characteristic signs of being made from bloomery iron. They contain slag stringers elongated by hammering, and their carbon content varies irregularly, producing a composite structure that modern rolled steel does not display. This is the fingerprint of a medieval Norse forge, and nothing comparable existed anywhere in the pre-Columbian Americas. The implications of an operational iron smithy on the shores of Newfoundland ripple through the entire narrative of the Vinland voyages. The sagas mention that Leif's crew built a large house and then explored the area, but they are silent about iron production. That detail is supplied uniquely by the archaeology. What the excavations reveal is that the Norse did not simply beach their ships and sleep in tents. They deliberately selected a location where bog iron was abundant, built a durable smithy, and immediately set about producing the iron needed to secure their vessels. This indicates a strategic mindset. The voyage leaders knew from their Greenland experience that iron was the critical bottleneck. Greenland had no native iron or beyond bog deposits, which were patchy and low-grade, and importing iron from Norway was astronomically expensive. A colony that could produce its own iron would be far more viable. Thus aux Meadows may have been, in part, a resource station intended to feed iron back to Greenland. Although no direct evidence of iron export has been found, the saga account of a later voyage to Markland in 1347 specifically mentions a ship going there for timber. It is entirely plausible that earlier voyages also sought iron-rich bog ore. The smithy at aux Meadows is therefore not just a workshop, it is a statement of colonial intent, an attempt to replicate the industrial base of the homeland in a new land. That the Norse were able to locate and exploit bog iron ore within a few kilometers of their landing site, and then successfully smelt it, speaks to a deep practical knowledge of geology and pyrotechnology that was shared among the Norse settlers and that was vital to their expansion across the North Atlantic. The smithy's location also tells us about the social organization of work at the settlement. It was placed approximately 20 meters east of Hall A, separated from the domestic area but within easy walking distance. The prevailing westerly winds would have carried the smoke and fumes from the smithy away from the halls, a deliberate design choice that the excavators confirmed through wind tunnel tests of the site topography. The smithy was not an isolated, autonomous structure. It was part of an integrated complex that included a small carpentry workshop, designated Structure K, just to its south, where wood chips and discarded shavings indicate that boat timbers were being shaped. This spatial pairing of iron and woodworking zones is a signature of Norse ship repair stations, and can be seen at the Viking Age harbour town of Koppang in Norway and at the royal estate of Toftanes in the Faroe Islands. The workforce would have been divided, a master smith and an assistant working the bellows, while carpenters trimmed and shaped replacement planks and oars nearby, periodically walking over to the smithy to obtain newly forged rivets. The smithy's small size suggests that only 1 or 2 smiths were at work at any time, but the volume of slag indicates sustained activity over at least a couple of seasons. The smiths likely were highly valued members of the expedition, perhaps freemen with special status, because the ability to produce iron in a remote location was not just a craft, but a survival skill. The tools of the smith, the hammer, tongs, and anvil, would have been brought from Greenland and were among the most precious objects on the voyage. Indeed, a piece of a possible hammerhead was recovered, though heavily corroded. In the Norse worldview, the smith was a figure of almost mythical power, associated with the dwarves of legend and the god Valander, and the establishment of a smithy on a new shore would have been an act imbued with both practical necessity and deep symbolic weight. Life inside the longhouses of aux Meadows was a transposition of the Norse domestic world into an alien landscape. The central hearth in Hall, stretching for 5 meters, was the heart of the dwelling, providing heat for cooking, light, and warmth during the foggy, damp summers. The fuel was principally spruce and fir, as attested by the charcoal species analysis, which shows a heavy reliance on the softwoods that surrounded the site. The hearth was lined with carefully fitted flat stones, and the adjacent earthen benches were covered with layers of soft bog moss and heather, topped by animal hides, to create a sleeping and seating platform that ran the length of the hall. Each person had an assigned space, with the chieftain or ship's captain occupying the high seat position in the middle of the long wall opposite the entrance, a place of honor marked by carved pillars or high seat posts that the sagas describe as having been thrown overboard when land was sighted, allowing the gods to guide the settlers to their new home. No high seat pillars were found at aux Meadows. Perhaps they were carried away when the site was abandoned, but the spatial layout of the floor deposits strongly suggests that Hall A had a clearly differentiated high-status area near the center of the north bench, where artifacts like the bronze pin and the best-preserved whetstones were concentrated. The remains of food, particularly the bones of seal, caribou, and seabirds, show that the inhabitants exploited the rich marine and terrestrial resources of the Strait of Belle Isle, but analysis of the bone chemistry reveals an interesting twist: the carbon and nitrogen isotope ratios in the human tooth fragments found on site. only a few, as no formal cemetery has been located, indicate a diet that still relied heavily on marine protein, similar to that of the Greenland Norse, suggesting the settlers had not yet transitioned to the terrestrial hunting that would have made them truly self-sufficient. They were fishing, hunting seals, and collecting birds' eggs, but the dietary signature remained that of seafarers, not farmers. The women at aux Meadows contributed critically to the survival and social fabric of the expedition, and the spindle whorl found in the hall is the clearest material witness to their presence. Spinning wool was an essential daily task in Norse households, because wool was the basis for clothing, bedding, and crucially, for the sailcloth and rope of the ships. The Norse longship's square woolen sail, typically about 90 square meters, required the wool of hundreds of sheep and thousands of hours of spinning and weaving. If a sail was damaged during the Atlantic crossing or the coastal exploration, repairing it would be a matter of life and death, and that work fell to women. The spindle whorl from aux Meadows is made of imported soapstone, turned on a lathe or carefully carved, and it is of the low whorl type that was common in the Norse colonies of the 11th century. It was found near the northern bench of Hull Sea, in an area that also yielded a concentration of sewing needles made of bone and antler, as well as small scraps of woven wool cloth preserved in the anaerobic soil. The cloth fragments, when magnified, reveal a simple tabby weave with Z-spun and S-spun threads consistent with the Norse warp-weighted loom tradition, and one fragment even shows a selvage, a reinforced edge, indicating that a professional-level textile worker was among the crew. The presence of women is further hinted at by small personal items, a polished bead of amber, a material whose nearest source was the Baltic coast, and a fragment of a jet-like black mineral, both of which were used as amulets and jewelry by Norse women. The sagas emphasize the role of women like Gudrid, who was praised not only for her beauty and wisdom but for her ability to manage the household and serve as a mediator, and the archaeological record at aux Meadows vividly confirms that women were not passive passengers but active agents of colonization. The health and demographics of the Norse group can be cautiously inferred from the small human bone sample and from paleopathological markers. A few human molars recovered from the midden area show severe wear typical of a coarse, stone-ground diet, but also exhibit dental caries and abscesses, which suggest a diet that, though rich in protein, included starchy foods like the wild grains and roots that the sagas mention. One molar shows enamel hypoplasia, a developmental defect indicating childhood malnutrition or disease, which is consistent with the stressed living conditions of the Greenland colony, where periodic famines were common. The age range of the individuals represented by the teeth spans from young adult to mature adult, with at least one adolescent indicated by a smaller, less worn tooth, hinting that families with children may have been present, just as the Karlsefni saga states that entire households with livestock made the journey. No infant remains have been found, which may reflect either low infant mortality or the brevity of the stay, but the demographic mix seems to match the saga's description of a colonizing expedition rather than a male-only raiding party. Additionally, the insect remains include body lice and flea species that are human-specific, indicating that the Norse carried these parasites with them and that crowding and hygiene issues were a reality. The louse eggs found cemented to cloth fragments prove that the settlers were dealing with the same itchy, disease-spreading companions that afflicted all pre-modern travelers. From these fragments of evidence, we can reconstruct a community that was demographically mixed, engaged in a full range of domestic, industrial, and maritime activities, and probably under considerable physical stress. A community that, for a few short years, tried to root itself in the New World before the combination of isolation, resource competition, and conflict with native inhabitants led it to withdraw. The abandonment of aux Meadows was not a chaotic flight, but an orderly withdrawal, as indicated by the condition of the structures when they were buried by time. The excavators found no evidence of destruction by fire or violence. No arrowheads were embedded in the timbers. No burned roof collapse. Instead, the buildings appear to have been deliberately dismantled in part, with the valuable roof timbers and interior wooden fittings removed, likely to be taken back to Greenland for reuse, given the chronic shortage of wood there. The hearths contained a final layer of clean sand spread over the ash, a ritual closing of the fire that has parallels in the archaeological record of Norse longhouse abandonment in Iceland and Greenland. The artifact assemblage was sparse, with most useful metal and soapstone objects taken away. What was left behind were broken or worn-out items, such as the discarded rivets, a cracked spindle whorl, and small, easily overlooked fragments. This pattern is consistent with a planned relocation rather than a panic-driven retreat. The environmental data support the idea that the occupation lasted only a few years. The pollen cores show a very brief spike in disturbance indicators, and the tree ring dates all cluster around 1021 with no sign of later repairs or new construction. The most plausible scenario, aligning both the sagas and the archaeology, is that after the deadly skirmishes with the Skrælings, the leaders of the expedition realized that they could not sustain a permanent settlement with the limited force they had and the vast distance from Greenland, and they decided to pack up and go home. The knowledge of the lands to the west, however, was not forgotten. The later voyages to Markland for timber, and the continued presence of Norse hunters on the coasts of Baffin Island and Labrador for centuries, proved that aux Meadows was not a dead end but the first node in a network of seasonal resource extraction that the Greenland Norse maintained for another 400 years. The botanical remains from aux Meadows are a treasure trove that directly illuminates the Vinland described in the sagas and the extent of Norse exploration beyond the camp. The most famous of these remains are the butternut shells and the piece of butternut wood. Butternut, Juglans cinerea, is a species of walnut native to eastern North America, and its natural range today does not extend north of the Miramichi River Basin in New Brunswick and the St. Lawrence River Valley below Quebec City, at least 400 kilometers southwest of aux Meadows. The presence of 3 butternut shells and a carefully shaved burl of butternut wood in a Norse archaeological layer is thus unequivocal evidence that the Norse traveled south along the coast of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, exploring the forested lowlands of what is now New Brunswick and possibly Nova Scotia. These nuts in the burrow were not accidentally transported by birds or currents. They were brought back to the base camp deliberately, probably as exotic curiosities and as raw material. The burl shows knife marks and appears to have been partially shaped, indicating it was a piece of craft wood. Butternut is a soft, easily carved hardwood much prized for bowls and spoons. This single piece of wood expands the Norse horizon from aux Meadows to the rich deciduous woodlands where the sagas place Vinland's grapevines. Wild grapes, Vitis riparia, riverbank grape, and Vitis labrusca, fox grape, are indeed abundant in the same region as butternut, growing in the river valleys that empty into the Baie des Chalets and the Northumberland Strait. The synthesis of saga text and archaeobotany is seamless. Leif's men found grapes and timber, and the butternuts confirm that they ventured into a much warmer, more fertile bioregion than northern Newfoundland. In a very real sense, aux Meadows was the door, and the Gulf of St. Lawrence was the room they entered. Beyond the charismatic butternuts, the carbonized plant macrofossils recovered from hearths and middens paint a detailed picture of the Norse diet and the local resources they exploited. Archaeobotanists have identified seeds of crowberry, bilberry, cloudberry, and raspberry, all native berries that ripen in late summer and were clearly gathered in bulk by the Norse, echoing the saga's description of fields of self-sown wheat and abundant berries. The self-sown wheat of the sagas is now understood to refer not to cultivated wheat but to wild-lime grass, Lamus arenarius, a dune-stabilizing grass whose tall, grain-bearing stalks were indeed harvested by the Norse in Greenland and Iceland and were likely gathered here as well. Charred seeds of knotweed and goosefoot, both edible wild plants, were also found, indicating that the settlers supplemented their meat diet with plant gathering. The presence of charred seeds of sedges and rushes suggests these were used as flooring material and insulation in the houses, then swept into the fire when they became soiled. A particularly fascinating find is the presence of seeds of bugloss, a plant associated with European medieval fields that may have been inadvertently introduced to the site from fodder or contaminated grain brought on the ships. If confirmed, this would be the first instance of a European plant species arriving in the Americas, centuries before the Columbian Exchange. The pollen record from the peat bog likewise contains a few grains of cereal-type pollen that are too large to be wild grasses. hinting that the Norse may have attempted to sow a small plot of barley or oats, although the evidence is too sparse to be certain. The overall image is of a community that was intensely engaged with the local environment, systematically exploiting the wild food resources of both the marine and the terrestrial ecosystems, and simultaneously maintaining a cultural attachment to the familiar plants of their northern homeland. The marine fauna excavated from the site underscores the extreme richness of the Strait of Belle that must have impressed the Norse, who came from Greenland's heavily hunted coastal waters. The bone assemblage includes harp seal, harbor seal, walrus, and a few bones of ringed seal, indicating that the settlers hunted on the pack ice and the rocky haulouts nearby. Harp seal, in particular, migrates in vast numbers along the Newfoundland coast in spring, and the age and seasonality of the seal bones, determined from dental annuli, suggest the Norse were present during the spring hunt and probably killed animals with iron-tipped lances or clubs. Walrus tusks or worked ivory have not been found at aux Meadows, but the presence of walrus bones indicates they were aware of this valuable resource, which in Greenland was the primary export commodity driving trade with Europe. The caribou bones show clear butchering marks from iron knives, and the age profile of the caribou suggests selective hunting of prime adults, a pattern typical of humans with efficient hunting technology, not of non-human predators. Fish remains are less well preserved due to the acidic soil, but a few vertebrae from large cod and salmon have been identified, matching the Sagas' enthusiastic description of enormous salmon. The sea bird bones, particularly those of great auk and common murre, imply that the Norse raided the bird colonies on the offshore islands, a dangerous but rewarding activity that yielded eggs, meat, and feathers. The sheer diversity of exploited species, from whales, a few whale bone fragments were found, likely scavenged from beached animals, to shorebirds, demonstrates that the Norse rapidly learned to harvest the full spectrum of local fauna, just as they had in Greenland. This adaptive hunting economy was the foundation upon which the exploration expeditions further south were launched, because the base camp needed a stable, surplus food supply to provision the crews. Butternuts and grapes were not the only exotic southern imports. A small amount of worked wood from deciduous trees not native to Newfoundland, including a possible fragment of white oak, was identified in the carpentry workshop. Oak does not grow on the Great Northern Peninsula. Its northern limit is about 200 kilometers south. This suggests that the Norse either repaired their ships with local oak they found on exploration trips, or that they brought oak timbers from Greenland and used them as templates. In either case, the presence of oak is significant because oak was the preferred wood for Norse shipbuilding, far superior to the softwoods available in Newfoundland, and the quest for oak and tall, straight pine masts was one of the main drivers of the Vinland voyages. The Saga of the Greenlanders mentions that Thorfinn Karlsefni loaded his ships with wood and other products of the land when he departed Vinland. The aux Meadows evidence suggests that wood was not merely the local spruce and fir but also selected high-value hardwoods from the southern forests. This exchange of resources, iron and ships for timber, furs, and prestige items, is the pattern that later defined the European fur trade with North America, and it began here, in the 11th century, on a modest scale. The Norse were not isolated explorers. They were the first links in a chain of transatlantic trade that would eventually transform the world, and the humble butternut shell, carbonized in a hearth at aux Meadows, is the emblem of that early, almost invisible, beginning of globalization. Contact with the indigenous peoples of the region is the most emotionally charged and archaeologically elusive aspect of the aux Meadows story. The sagas describe the Skraelings in vivid terms. They were short, dark-haired, and clad in animal skins. They arrived in fleets of skin boats. They traded furs and pelts for red cloth and dairy products, and they fought with arrows and slings, using a large blue-black ball that the Norse thought was a war machine but which modern scholars identify as a walrus stomach float or a bladder. The archaeological record at aux Meadows contains no direct evidence of Skraeling presence within the settlement, such as stone tools characteristic of the contemporary indigenous cultures. The Norse site is remarkably pristine of non-Norse artifacts. However, this absence is itself informative. The Norse settlers were aware of the indigenous presence, and apparently took measures to avoid contact, or at least to control it. The settlement's location on a raised marine terrace with good visibility in all directions, and the deliberate compactness of the buildings behind a single access point, suggests a defensive posture. The smithy, with its ability to produce weapons, was located on the approach from the sea, perhaps to equip a guard. The sagas mention that the Norse built a stockade around their camp after the first hostile encounter, and while no stockade has been archaeologically detected, likely because it would have been a simple wooden palisade whose posts rotted away, the idea of fortification matches the settlement's spatial logic. The neighboring indigenous groups at that time were the ancestors of the Beothuk and possibly the maritime archaic descendants, as well as the Dorset Paleo-Eskimo who inhabited Labrador and perhaps visited the island. These peoples had sophisticated stone toolkits, marine hunting skills, and a deep familiarity with the terrain, and they would have observed the Norse arrival with intense interest, curiosity, and quite possibly alarm. The nature of the Norse-Skraeling interaction can be inferred from the distribution of Norse material culture in indigenous sites across the region. A very small number of Norse or Norse-derived objects have been found in Dorset and pre-Dorset sites on Baffin Island and in Labrador, including fragments of smelted copper and iron, spun wool, and a piece of a bronze bowl. These finds, while not directly linked to aux Meadows, suggest that the Norse and the Dorset were trading over long distances, exchanging metal and textiles for marine ivory, furs, and information. At aux Meadows itself, a single Dorset-type harpoon head made of antler was reportedly found in the general vicinity, but not in a secure Norse context. It is possible that the Norse collected indigenous artifacts as souvenirs or tools, or that indigenous people occasionally visited the abandoned site after the Norse left. The butternut transport also indicates that the Norse moved through indigenous territories in the south. The fact that they were able to gather butternuts and grapes and return with them suggests either that they traveled in small, stealthy reconnaissance parties or that initial contact was peaceful enough to allow for resource collection. The saga account of a trade that turned sour over a bull echoes a common pattern in cross-cultural encounters: initial exchanges of goods, followed by a misunderstanding or a breach of protocol, and then violence. The Norse, with their iron weapons and aggressive war culture, would have been formidable opponents in a fight, but they were vastly outnumbered and far from home. The decision to abandon Vinland, according to the sagas, was ultimately a recognition that, although the land was good, there would always be war and terror hanging over them there from those who already inhabited it. This colonial calculus, born at aux Meadows, prefigures the entire subsequent history of European colonization in the Americas. The climate of the North Atlantic at the time of the Vinland voyages was entering the medieval warm period, a phase of relatively mild temperatures that lasted roughly from 950 to 1250 AD. This climatic window was crucial to the success of the Norse expansion. Sea ice in the Davis Strait was reduced, making the crossing from Greenland to Baffin Island and Labrador safer and shorter. Cod, seals, and whales were abundant in the waters around Newfoundland, providing a reliable food supply for a maritime people. The northern treeline was slightly higher in altitude and latitude, meaning that the forests of Labrador and Newfoundland were thicker and richer than they would be during the subsequent Little Ice Age, which began in the 14th century and devastated the Greenland colonies. The favorable climate was the underlying enabler of the Vinland expeditions, and its deterioration later may help explain why permanent settlement never took hold. The short-term paleoclimate record from the aux Meadows peat bogs shows a period of relatively warm and dry conditions around 1000 to 1050 AD, with increased charcoal particles from natural fires and possibly Norse clearing. This was followed by a cooling trend and increased precipitation that would have made the area less attractive for turf-based dwellings and more difficult for navigation. The Norse, arriving at the peak of the warm pulse, may have gotten an unusually favorable impression of the land, only to find the climate turning against them within a generation. The sagas mention a winter of great hardship and much sickness, which could reflect not only the challenge of limited supplies but also the onset of colder, wetter weather. In this sense, aux Meadows was a fleeting frontier of the medieval warm period, a settlement that bloomed at the climatic optimum and then was abandoned as the window of opportunity began to close. The cultural memory of Vinland persisted in Iceland and Norway, but its location faded into legend. The 16th century cartographers, influenced by the rediscovery of Ptolemy and the early reports of the New World, sometimes labeled a region in the North Atlantic as Vinland the Good. The Ortelius map of 1570 marks in Estodolanda and Drogeo in the general area, but the direct connection to the Norse sagas was lost. It was not until the 19th century revival of saga studies and the archaeological revolution of the 20th century that Vinland was pulled back from myth to history. aux Meadows thus stands at the intersection of two great historical narratives: the saga of the medieval Norse, which it confirms, and the saga of modern science, which it epitomizes. The discovery and excavation of the site by Helge and Anne Stine Ingstad is itself a remarkable story of intellectual courage, cross-disciplinary rigor, and international cooperation. The Ingstad's work did not just find a site, it founded a field, Norse North American archaeology, that now extends from the high Arctic to the coast of Maine. Every subsequent find of a Norse artifact in an indigenous context, every new radiocarbon date from a Labrador sod hut, builds on the foundation they laid. As we continue to explore the deep history of human movement across the Atlantic, aux Meadows remains the keystone, the one indisputable physical proof that the Old World and the New World were connected long before 1492, and that the human story of transoceanic contact began not with the caravels of Spain, but with the dragon-proud ships of the North. The process of pinning the saga narratives directly onto the archaeological facts of aux Meadows requires a careful reading of the textual details alongside the material evidence. The saga of the Greenlander states that Leif built a large house at the mouth of a river that flowed into a lake, and that the surrounding meadows were so lush that cattle grazed there all winter. The geography at aux Meadows matches this remarkably well. The site is located on a terrace near the mouth of the Black Duck Brook, which flows out of a series of small lakes just inland. The raised marine terrace creates a natural amphitheater of grassland that would indeed have provided fodder for small numbers of grazing animals. The saga's mention of salmon in the river is validated by the Atlantic salmon that still run up the brook to spawn in late summer, a resource that would have been astonishing to Norse from Greenland, where salmon are virtually absent. The saga describes Turkar finding grapes in a hollow in the woods, and while grapes do not grow at aux Meadows today, the presence of grape pollen in the peat cores from the area, dated to the same time period, shows that wild grapes grew at least as far north as the Strait of Belle Isle during the warmer 11th century. Thus even the most famously doubted detail, the grapes, has an environmental basis. The butternuts, which definitively do not grow in Newfoundland, indicate that the Norse brought back samples from the south, and it is possible that Turkar's discovery of grapes occurred not at the base camp but during a voyage into the Gulf, and the memory of the event was simply attached to the settlement site in the telling. This is a common pattern in oral history. The adventures of the entire expedition are condensed around the home base. The saga of Erik the Red's account of Karlsefni's colony adds geographic detail that can be tested against the landscape. The saga describes a place called Hop, a tidal lagoon or estuary where the Norse spent the summer harvesting grapes and timber. Many scholars, including the Ingstads, identify Hop with the Miramichi Bay area in New Brunswick or the Baie des Chalets, both of which are large, shallow tidal estuaries with extensive salt marshes, abundant wild grapes, and significant Mi'kmaq First Nation presence that could account for the Skraeling encounters. The distance from aux Meadows to Miramichi Bay is approximately 600 kilometers by sea, a journey of 3 to 4 days in a Norse nar, assuming favorable winds. The butternut shells at aux Meadows came from exactly this region, connecting the hop of the saga to the archaeobotanical trail. The saga's description of the Skraeling's boats as being made of skins matches the birch bark canoes of the Algonquian peoples, though the skin boats could also refer to the larger Umiak-like vessels. The items the Norse traded, red cloth and milk, are wonderfully specific. Red woolen cloth, dyed with madder, was a high-status trade item in the Norse world, and milk and dairy products were a defining feature of Norse subsistence that would have been utterly foreign and perhaps even magical to indigenous peoples who were lactose intolerant. The archaeology supports the presence of woven wool, and the dung beetle evidence supports the presence of livestock that could have provided the milk. When the saga says that a bull ran out of the woods and frightened the Skraelings, causing a battle, we can visualize the actual livestock pens near the settlement and the terror that a large, unfamiliar animal would have caused. These details are not proof that every line of the saga is literally true, but they demonstrate that the saga writers were working from a genuine tradition of real events observed and transmitted by people who had been there. The conflict with the Skraelings and the death of Thorvald are episodes that have left no direct archaeological trace, but they are consistent with the overall evidence for the settlement's abandonment. Thorvald's death, as recounted, occurred when his ship was exploring a wooded coast, and he and his men killed 8 Skraelings they found sleeping under skin boats. A 9th escaped and returned with a larger force, and Thorvald was struck by an arrow in the groin. He reportedly pulled the arrow out himself, and with grim humor, declared that he had gotten rich lands, but I will not enjoy them. He then told his men to bury him there and to plant crosses at the head and foot of his grave, making him the first recorded European to die and be buried in North America. If this burial occurred somewhere on the coast of Labrador or the Gulf of St. Lawrence, it is not surprising that it has not been found. The coastal erosion, forest growth, and the anonymity of a single grave make it archaeologically invisible. What is significant is that the saga records a specific, named individual's death in a precise location, and this narrative was remembered for over 200 years before being written down. The consistency between the archaeological evidence for a short, conflict-ridden occupation and the saga's account of Thorvald's fatal encounter with the Skraelings strengthens the overall historical credibility of the Vinland tradition. The religious dimension of the Vinland voyages is often overlooked but is essential to understanding the motivations of the settlers. Leif Erikson had been converted to Christianity by King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway around 999 AD and was charged with bringing the new faith to Greenland. The saga recounts that Leif's mother, Jodhild, built a small church at Brattle, and its ruins have been excavated, complete with a surrounding churchyard. The Vinland voyages occurred at the very moment when the Norse were transitioning from their old pagan religion to Christianity, and this spiritual upheaval colored their exploration. The crosses that Thorvald requested on his grave, the absence of pagan grave goods at aux Meadows, and the overall emphasis in the sagas on Gudrid's piety, she later made a pilgrimage to Rome and became a nun, all indicate that the Vinland expeditions were undertaken by people who saw themselves as Christian explorers, perhaps even on a divine mission. The small greenish glass bead found at aux Meadows, of a type common in the Christianized Norse world, might have been a prayer bead. The decision to abandon the settlement, despite its resources, may also have had a spiritual component. The encounter with the Skraelings may have been interpreted as a sign from God that the land was not meant for the Norse, or the internal discord mentioned in the sagas might have been exacerbated by the tensions between pagan and Christian members of the party. Religion and colonization are always intertwined, and the Vinland voyages were as much a pilgrimage into the unknown as they were an economic enterprise. The strategic significance of aux Meadows can only be understood within the broader network of Norse North Atlantic navigation and resource extraction. The Norse presence in the Western Atlantic was not limited to a single voyage. It was a sustained, multi-century pattern of seasonal voyages from the Greenland settlements to the coasts of Baffin Island, Labrador, and possibly beyond. We now know, from the discovery of Norse artifacts in Thule and Dorset sites on Baffin Island and the adjacent coasts, that the Greenland Norse maintained a kind of northern hunting zone, the Norseter, where they traveled annually to hunt walrus, seals, and polar bears, and to trade with the Dorset and later the Thule Inuit. aux Meadows, located much farther south, represents the southernmost extension of this network, what might be called the Surseter, the southern hunting and timber-gathering zone. The difference is that the northern zone was exploited for centuries with relative success and little evidence of violent conflict, while the southern zone proved too dangerous and too distant to sustain. Yet the logic was the same: the Greenland colony, perched on the edge of the habitable world, had to reach out to resource-rich peripheries to obtain the essentials, timber, iron, and perhaps even grain, that its home environment could not supply. The Vinland voyages were the extreme edge of a colonial economy based on mobility and extraction, and aux Meadows was the remote field station where the southern prong of that economy was tested and ultimately abandoned. The maritime technology that made aux Meadows possible was the Nar, the ocean-going cargo vessel of the Viking Age. Unlike the long, narrow longship built for war and speed, the Nar was shorter, beamier, and deeper drafted, designed to carry heavy cargoes of up to 30 tons across open ocean. It had a single square sail and a crew of 6 to 10 sailors, and it could make 5 to 7 knots in a fair wind. The voyage from the western settlement of Greenland to aux Meadows, approximately 1,600 nautical miles, would have taken about 2 to 3 weeks, with stops along the way at predetermined landmarks. The Norse navigators used a combination of dead reckoning, observations of bird flight, wave patterns, and possibly sunstones, Iceland spar, to determine the direction of the sun even in overcast conditions, enabling them to follow latitudinal sailing routes with remarkable precision. The experimental voyages of modern replicas, such as the Gaia and Saga Farman, have demonstrated that a Norse Nar can indeed make this passage safely, and that the journey from Greenland to Newfoundland is well within the capabilities of 11th century seamen. Once at aux Meadows, the Nars would be beached on the sand and gravel of Epaves Bay at high tide, their bows just a few meters from the smithy. The bay's shallow, gently sloping bottom is ideal for beaching a vessel without damaging the hull, and the protected cove offered refuge from the fierce north and east winds. The Norse could then unload their cargo, set up camp in the existing longhouses, and begin the work of repairing their ships and gathering resources, before heading back north or further south into the Gulf. aux Meadows was, in every sense, a port, albeit a port without a permanent population, and its design reflects a sophisticated understanding of the interplay between ship technology, weather, and geography. The economic calculus behind the Vinland voyages is illuminated by the resource shortages that the Greenland colony faced. The Greenlanders needed wood for building houses, making furniture, constructing boats, and burning as fuel. The native Greenland vegetation, mainly dwarf willow and birch, was insufficient for anything beyond small-scale use. Driftwood carried by the East Greenland current from Siberia provided some timber, but it was unpredictable and often saturated with salt. Timber from Markland and Vinland, on the other hand, was abundant, accessible, and free for the taking. The saga of the later, Markland voyage, in 1347 explicitly states that a Greenland ship went to Markland to gather timber, and was blown off course to Iceland. This event, recorded in the Icelandic annals, proves that the Greenlanders maintained a direct timber trade with Labrador for at least 350 years after the abandonment of aux Meadows. The butternut and grapevine suggest that the Vinland area also offered high-value prestige goods, exotic nuts, decorative woods, perhaps even furs obtained in trade, that could enhance the status of the chieftains back in Greenland. Additionally, the sagas mention that Karlsefni's expedition found a whale of a kind they had never seen before, which could refer to a rich fishery of right whales or bowhead whales in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, whose oil and baleen would have been immensely valuable. The economic motivation was thus strong, but the costs, the loss of ships and lives to storms, the danger from indigenous attack, and the sheer logistical difficulty of maintaining a transatlantic supply chain, ultimately outweighed the benefits. The cessation of the Vinland voyages was an economic decision forced by harsh reality, not a failure of nerve or technology. The legacy of the Vinland voyages extends far beyond the archaeological site itself, into the genetic and cultural heritage of the North Atlantic. A remarkable piece of evidence lies in the genetics of the Icelandic population. In 2010, researchers discovered a unique mitochondrial DNA lineage, known as C1e, in a small number of modern Icelanders. This lineage is not found in any European population, but is most closely related to Native American and East Asian haplogroups. Detailed analysis of the mutations suggests that it diverged from the American branch around 1000 AD, precisely the time of the Vinland voyages. The most plausible explanation is that a Native American woman, perhaps a captive or a voluntary companion, was brought back to Iceland by the Norse explorers. The sagas do not mention such an event explicitly, but they do note that Karlsefni took 2 Skraeling children on his return voyage and baptized them. It is entirely plausible that one or more indigenous women ended up in Iceland, where they integrated into the small, isolated population and left a lasting genetic signature. This genetic trace is the ultimate vindication of the pre-Columbian contact. The people of the Old and New Worlds did not just meet, they shared blood, in a union that is now written into the DNA of living people. The discovery of aux Meadows opened the door to this line of research, and it continues to yield insights into the deepest and most intimate consequences of the Norse arrival in America. The preservation and management of aux Meadows as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, inscribed in 1978, has been a model of community-based stewardship and scholarly collaboration. The site, officially designated as aux Meadows National Historic Site by Parks Canada, encompasses not only the archaeological remains themselves but a large buffer zone of the coastal landscape that preserves the viewscape and ecological context of the Norse settlement. The decision to rebury the original archaeological features, after fully documenting them, and to construct exact replicas of the turf buildings a few hundred meters away, was a deliberate choice made in consultation with archaeologists and conservators. The original artifact-bearing layers are now protected under a thick layer of sterile sand and geotextile fabric, while the replica site allows visitors to walk through a reconstructed Norse hall, touch the turf walls, smell the peat smoke, and experience the living conditions of the 11th century settlers without damaging the genuine remains. The replica smithy features a working forge where interpreters dressed in period clothing demonstrate iron smelting and rivet making using traditional methods and local bog iron. This approach, pioneered at aux Meadows, has since been emulated at other archaeological sites around the world and reflects the Ingstad's vision that the site should be not just a place of academic study but a place where the public can connect viscerally with the past. The ongoing research at aux Meadows, more than 60 years after the initial excavation, continues to yield new discoveries. Technological advances in remote sensing, such as ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry, have been applied to the site and its surroundings, revealing several previously unknown anomalies that may represent additional Norse structures or activity areas beyond the original 8-building complex. There is intense interest in exploring the intertidal zone of Epaves Bay, where rising sea levels since the 11th century may have submerged parts of the beach frontage, including possible boat docks or slipways made of logs. Palynological cores taken from deeper lakes and bogs in the vicinity are being reanalyzed using high-resolution techniques that can detect microcharcoal, coprophilous fungal spores indicative of grazing animals, and phytoliths of introduced plants. A multi-institutional project named Vinland Revisited is using isotopic sourcing of the stone materials, the soapstone, the whetstones, the slate lamp, to pinpoint the exact quarries in Greenland and Labrador, tracing the supply routes that link the station to its homeland. Additionally, environmental DNA, EDNA, is being extracted from the site's soils to detect the presence of specific organisms, including domestic animal DNA and human DNA, which may allow researchers to determine the species and even the genetic signature of the livestock and the settlers without finding bones. These cutting-edge methods are transforming the site from a static monument into a dynamic laboratory where new questions can be asked and answered, ensuring that the full story of Vinland is still being written. The impact of the aux Meadows discovery on the broader public understanding of history cannot be overstated. Before 1960, the narrative of American history, as taught in schools across the United States and Canada, typically began with Columbus's arrival in 1492, or at the earliest with John Cabot's voyage to Newfoundland in 1497. The indigenous presence was acknowledged but often marginalized, and the idea that Europeans had reached the continent earlier was treated as fanciful. aux Meadows demolished that framework. It forced textbook writers to rewrite the opening chapters and introduced an entire generation to the Norse sagas and to the reality of a pre-Columbian Atlantic world. In Newfoundland and Labrador, The site became a source of intense provincial pride, anchoring a narrative that the island was not a remote outpost but the gateway to the Americas. The discovery also reshaped the identity of the modern Nordic countries, which had long claimed the Viking explorers as cultural heroes but now had scientific proof of their transatlantic achievement. The 1000th anniversary of Leif Erikson's voyage, celebrated in 2000, saw international festivals, replica ship voyages, and the minting of commemorative coins, with aux Meadows serving as the geographic and symbolic heart of the festivities. The site thus serves as a unifying symbol of transatlantic heritage, connecting Europe, Iceland, Greenland, and North America in a shared history of exploration and encounter. The interpretive challenges of presenting aux Meadows to a diverse public are considerable, and Parks Canada has developed a nuanced narrative that honors both the Norse achievement and the long pre-existing Indigenous history of the region. Interpretive panels and guided tours emphasize that while the Norse were the first Europeans to set foot in North America, the continent was already home to millions of indigenous people with their own rich civilizations, and that the Beothuk and their ancestors had been living in Newfoundland for thousands of years before Leif arrived. The story of the Skrælings is told not as a footnote to the Norse saga but as a crucial part of the encounter, with displays of Dorset and Beothuk tools and a discussion of the indigenous oral traditions that may preserve memories of these pale strangers. This inclusive approach reflects a contemporary ethos of historical interpretation that seeks to move beyond Eurocentric triumphalism and toward a more balanced understanding of contact and colonization. The site also addresses the painful irony that the Norse, who were themselves colonizers, were later followed by Europeans who, armed with superior technology and disease, would devastate the indigenous populations the Norse had only briefly encountered. aux Meadows thus stands as a place of reflection on the entire sweep of North American history, from the first human migrations across Beringia, through the brief Norse interlude, to the age of European empire and its consequences. The artistic and literary legacy of Vinland and aux Meadows permeates modern culture, from epic novels to video games. The image of the Viking standing on a windswept beach, gazing at an unknown continent, has become a foundational trope of the North American imagination. Writers from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, with his poem, The Skeleton in Armor, to the Nobel laureate Halldor Laxness, whose novel, Paradise Reclaimed, touches on the Vinland voyages, have drawn on the sagas to explore themes of discovery, exile, and cultural collision. In popular culture, the Vinland voyages have been dramatized in films and television series, including the History Channel's Vikings, which brought the character of Leif Erikson to a global audience with a mix of historical authenticity and dramatic license. The manga and anime series, Vinland Saga, while taking extensive creative liberties, has introduced millions of young people in Japan and around the world to the Norse exploration of America, generating a renewed interest in the medieval North Atlantic. The replica site at aux Meadows itself has served as a location for documentary films and has been photographed countless times by travelers who feel a magnetic pull to the place where two hemispheres first touched. The tangible, visitable reality of the site gives the stories a grounding that pure text cannot provide, allowing people to stand in the very spot where a Norse woman dropped her spindle whorl and to imagine the sound of a hammer on hot iron carried by the wind across Apaves Bay. Academic scholarship on the Vinland phenomenon has proliferated, creating a rich interdisciplinary field that spans archaeology, history, literary studies, linguistics, and environmental science. The journal, Vinland Revisited, published periodically, compiles the latest research on Norse America, and international conferences regularly bring together scholars from Canada, the United States, Iceland, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. One of the most significant scholarly developments of recent years has been the re-examination of the indigenous side of the Vinland encounter, as archaeologists and ethnohistorians work with the Innu, the Nunatsiavut Inuit, and the Mi'kmaq communities to identify sites that may reflect the indigenous experience of the Norse arrival. The Norse term, Skræling, itself has been the subject of considerable linguistic analysis, with some scholars suggesting it derives from an Old Norse word for wretch or weakling, while others link it to a term meaning screamer. perhaps referring to the high-pitched war cries of the indigenous defenders. This linguistic work, while speculative, highlights the importance of understanding the Vinland story from multiple perspectives. The field is also grappling with the broader ethical questions raised by the celebration of a colonial episode, even one that ended in failure, and with the need to respect the indigenous descendants who see the site as part of a much older human history that the Norse only briefly interrupted. The economic and tourism impact of aux Meadows on the local community of the Great Northern Peninsula is substantial. The site attracts over 30,000 visitors each year, a significant number for a remote region with a population of only a few thousand. The nearby town of St. Anthony has developed a range of visitor services, including hotels, restaurants, and craft shops, that cater to the tourist trade. The Viking theme has been embraced by local entrepreneurs, with replica Viking ship tours, interactive forge your own rivet experiences, and a Viking-themed festival held annually. The provincial government of Newfoundland and Labrador promotes the site as part of its Viking Trail tourism corridor, which stretches from Deer Lake to St. Anthony and includes other attractions such as the Grenfell Historic Properties and the spectacular fjord of Western Brook Pond. The international profile of the site was raised significantly when it served as a focal point of the 2000 Millennium celebrations, and it continues to benefit from the global interest in all things Norse fueled by popular media. The economic benefits, however, come with the challenge of protecting the archaeological integrity of the site from the very popularity that sustains the region, and Parks Canada enforces strict visitor protocols, including guided access only to the replica site and a limited, carefully monitored trail system around the original ruins. Looking to the future, the potential for further archaeological discoveries related to the Norse in North America is vast and largely untapped. The success of the Ingstad's methodology, ask local people, look for coastal meadow sites, test for iron slag, remains the most effective search strategy, and it has led to the discovery of potential Norse sites on Baffin Island, such as Nanook and Tanfield Valley, where stone structures, spun cordage, and ratnod would strongly suggest a Norse presence engaged in trade with the Dorset. The southern coasts of Labrador and the Quebec shore of the Gulf of St. Lawrence remain largely unexamined by archaeologists with an explicit focus on Norse materials. The story of Butternuts points toward New Brunswick as a major area of Norse activity, and it is only a matter of time and funding before systematic surveys of the Miramichi and Chilla Bay regions are conducted using the latest remote sensing and coring technologies. The discovery of another camp, or even a single Norse-cut log in an indigenous midden, would revolutionize our understanding of the extent and duration of the Norse presence. In the ultimate sense, aux Meadows is not the end of the Vinland story, it is the beginning. It provides the proof of concept that allows archaeologists to push further, to ask bigger questions, and to imagine a North America in the second millennium AD that was already a nexus of global contacts, long before the caravels appeared on the horizon. Connecting the specific narrative of aux Meadows to the overarching theme of our series, Stories of Our History, requires reflecting on what this discovery means for our understanding of human courage and curiosity. The Norse who built those turf halls and fired that forge were not superheroes or demigods. They were ordinary men and women from a marginal colony, driven by the same imperatives that have pushed people to cross oceans throughout history: the search for land, for resources, for a better life. They risked everything in open boats on one of the most dangerous stretches of water in the world, and they achieved something that would not be repeated for half a millennium. Yet the story is not just about triumph, it is also about failure and humility. The Norse were not able to hold their foothold. The land was not empty, and those who already lived there resisted. The dream of a Vinland colony died on that windy terrace, and for 500 years the secret lay buried under the grass until a Norwegian explorer and his archaeologist wife listened to the tales of fishermen and recognized the shape of a longhouse in the soil. This cycle of vision, endeavor, defeat, and rediscovery is a deeply human story that transcends any one culture or era. It reminds us that history is not a straight line but a series of overlapping waves, and that the past is always present, waiting under our feet for someone to ask the right questions. As we walk away from the rebuilt halls of aux Meadows and look out over the grey waters of the Strait of Belle Isle, we carry with us the knowledge that the Atlantic has never been a barrier. It has always been a highway, and the first Europeans to travel it to America were not those we were taught about in school, but a small band of Norsemen and Norse women whose saga is now confirmed in iron, charcoal, and wood. The detailed examination of aux Meadows also reveals the profound interconnectedness of human societies in the medieval period. The bronze ring-headed pin from Dublin, the soapstone spindle whorl from a Labrador quarry, the butternut from the Miramichi, the Icelandic sagas written on vellum in the 13th century. All these fragments come together in a single archaeological site on the tip of Newfoundland's great northern peninsula, creating a web of connections that stretches from the shores of Loch Ness to the forests of New Brunswick. This is a powerful demonstration that globalization did not begin with the Spanish galleons or the British East India Company. It began when small groups of people with boats, and the courage to use them, started exchanging goods, genes, and ideas across vast distances. The Norse were the first to stitch together the North Atlantic rim into a single maritime sphere, and aux Meadows is the physical proof of that achievement. The story of Vinland is thus not an isolated curiosity, but a crucial chapter in the larger story of how the world became one. It is a story that belongs to everyone, to the Icelanders who preserved the sagas, to the Norwegians who excavated the site, to the Canadians who protected, to the indigenous peoples whose ancestors encountered the strangers, and to all of us who seek to understand where we came from and how we got here. The turf walls may be silent, but the message they carry is one of enduring human ambition, and as long as we listen, they will continue to speak. The preservation and interpretation of aux Meadows also serve as a model for how we can handle contested and emotionally charged historical sites in a globalized world. The site is simultaneously a National Historic Site of Canada, a UNESCO World Heritage Site of Humanity, a sacred place for the descendants of the indigenous peoples, and a cultural icon for Scandinavians. Balancing these multiple meanings requires a collaborative, consultative approach that was largely absent in 1960 when the Ingstads began digging, but that has become central to the site's management today. Parks Canada works with the Historic Sites Association of Newfoundland and Labrador and with First Nations groups to ensure that the presentation of the site includes Indigenous perspectives and acknowledges the land as the traditional territory of the Beothuk and their ancestors. This process of reconciliation through historical interpretation is ongoing and imperfect, but it points the way toward a more inclusive way of telling history, one in which the encounter between Norse and Skraeling is not framed as a simple tale of winners and losers but as a complex, multivocal meeting of worlds. aux Meadows, by its very nature, forces us to confront the fact that there is no single discovery of America, but a series of arrivals and contacts stretching back tens of thousands of years, and that the Norse landing is just one tile in a vast mosaic of human movement. Finally, the personal story of Helge and Anne Stine Ingstad deserves to be remembered as an integral part of the aux Meadows narrative. Helge was 60 years old when he began his search for Vinland, an age when most people have long since settled into comfortable routines. Anne Stine was a respected archaeologist who could have stayed in Norway and pursued a conventional academic career, but instead she chose to spend 7 field seasons in a remote, windswept camp, directing an excavation that would define her legacy. Their partnership was a fusion of vision and rigor, and neither could have succeeded without the other. Helge's ability to read the landscape and talk to locals opened the door, and Stine's exacting excavation methods proved that what lay behind that door was real. They faced considerable skepticism from the academic establishment, and they had to endure years of debate before the site was fully accepted. Yet they persisted, and their names are now permanently linked to one of the most important archaeological sites in the Americas. The replica longhouse at aux Meadows contains a small exhibit honoring the Ingstads, and visitors often leave notes of gratitude. Their story is a testament to the power of intellectual passion and marital partnership, and it adds a deeply human layer to the already rich saga of Vinland. As we conclude our exploration of this remarkable place, we remember that history is made by individuals with the courage to challenge accepted beliefs, and that the past is never truly lost as long as there are people willing to dig it up and share it with the world. The Norse arrival at aux Meadows did not occur in isolation. It was the culmination of a staggering 3-century maritime expansion that propelled Scandinavian seafarers from the fjords of Norway to the edge of the known world. Beginning around 790 AD with the first Viking raids on England, Norse shipwrights perfected the longship and the nar, vessels that combined shallow draft for river navigation with a flexible, clinker-built hull that could flex in heavy seas rather than break. By 874, Norse settlers had colonized Iceland, discovering an uninhabited island that they swiftly transformed into a republic of chieftains and free farmers. The settlement of Iceland itself was a project of remarkable organizational skill. Within 60 years, all arable land was claimed, and a sophisticated legal system, the Althing, was established at Ingvellir in 930. This rapid colonization established a pattern the Norse would repeat in Greenland and attempt in Vinland: the transportation of entire households, livestock, seeds, and tools across hostile waters, with the expectation of building a self-sufficient farming society. The demographic pressure in Iceland, combined with a culture that rewarded adventure and land-taking, created a continuous outward push that made the leap to Greenland inevitable. When Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland in 982, sailed west and found a forbidding but habitable land, he knew exactly what he was looking for, and his salesmanship in naming it Greenland was a stroke of propaganda that succeeded in luring about 500 settlers in the initial wave of 985-986. The Greenland colonies, the eastern settlement centered on modern Qaqortoq and the western settlement near Nuuk, quickly grew to a peak population of perhaps 2,500 to 3,000 individuals, living in scattered farmsteads that mirrored those of Iceland, complete with churches, a bishop's seat at Gerir, and regular communication with the Norwegian homeland. It was from this frontier society, constantly hungry for timber, iron, and new pasture, that Leif Erikson and his fellow explorers set out for the lands west of Greenland, and the cultural and technological toolkit they brought to aux Meadows was forged in this chain of prior colonial ventures. The turf walls of the Newfoundland longhouses are the direct architectural descendants of Icelandic and Greenlandic farmsteads, and the iron smelting techniques visible in the smithy were the same bloomery methods that had been carried from Norway to the Faroe Islands and onward. Understanding aux Meadows requires seeing it as the farthest node in a network that already spanned over 3,000 kilometers of the North Atlantic, a network that functioned not through imperial edict but through the initiative of independent shipowners, chieftains, and family groups operating in an environment where risk and reward were intensely personal. The technology of the Norse vessels that reached aux Meadows was nothing short of revolutionary for its time, and its details are crucial to grasping how a transatlantic crossing was possible 500 years before Columbus's caravels. The nar, the cargo workhorse of the Vinland voyages, was a vessel typically 16 to 22 meters in length, with a beam of 5 to 6 meters, and a cargo capacity of up to 30 metric tons. It was built from oak when available, but the Greenland ships were more likely constructed from imported Norwegian pine or local driftwood, with iron rivets fastening the overlapping strakes. The square sail, woven from wool and smeared with animal fat to improve wind resistance, could be as large as 90 square meters, and the rigging was made of walrus hide rope or hemp. Experimental archaeology with replica vessels like the Saga Farman has demonstrated that a nar could average 4 to 6 knots in a moderate breeze, making the passage from the western settlement of Greenland to aux Meadows, roughly 1,500 nautical miles, in 14 to 20 days of sailing, with stops in the sheltered fjords of Baffin Island and Labrador. The navigational techniques were a blend of empirical observation and what we would now call dead reckoning. The Norse monitored the color and temperature of the water, the presence of sea birds and driftwood, and the zenith of the sun at noon, possibly using a bearing dial and a sunstone, a piece of Icelandic spar that polarizes light, enabling the sun's position to be found even through cloud. The latitude sailing method meant that a pilot departing from Greenland would head west and then south, following the 60th parallel until it intersected with the North American coast, a route that inevitably brought them to the shores of Baffin Island and Labrador. The discovery of aux Meadows was not accidental. It was the predictable outcome of a deliberate, long-range scouting strategy that used the entire Greenland-Iceland-Norway maritime corridor as its logistical backbone. The establishment of the smithy and boat repair station at the site was the logical endpoint of a voyage plan that anticipated the need for maintenance after a long ocean crossing, just as the Viking fleets had always established temporary bases, known as longforts, during their campaigns in Ireland and England. The Norse did not stumble onto a new continent. They executed a well-practiced sequence of exploration, resource assessment, and temporary fortification that had been honed over generations of expansion. The social structure of the Vinland expeditions, as revealed by the sagas and reinforced by the archaeology, was that of a chieftain-led enterprise typical of the Viking Age, but with the added complexity of operating at an immense distance from any higher authority. Leif Erikson, the son of the founder of Greenland, was a man of considerable inherited status, and his voyage was partly an exercise in maintaining that status by securing new wealth and resources. The crew of 35 men mentioned in the saga of the Greenlanders was substantial for a single ship, and it likely included a cross-section of free farmers, skilled craftsmen, and perhaps a few enslaved individuals, thralls, though the latter are not named. The presence of women is confirmed by the spindle whorl, and the saga descriptions of women like Gudrid and Fride as playing central roles, indicating that the Norse vision of colonization always included the establishment of a complete household economy. The decision-making process on such an expedition would have been collaborative but hierarchical, with the leader holding ultimate authority over navigation, resource allocation, and diplomacy or conflict with indigenous peoples. The sagas vividly illustrate the tensions that could arise. In the saga of the Greenlanders, Freydis, Leif's sister, organizes her own expedition and later orchestrates the murder of her business partner's wives with an axe, a story that, whether literally true or embroidered, reflects the extreme stress and moral fracturing that could occur in a remote, unsupervised outpost. The archaeological record at aux Meadows, with its evidence of orderly dismantling and removal of valuables, suggests that the final departure was made under competent leadership that managed to extract the community safely. But the saga accounts of violent internal conflict and hostile external encounters remind us that the social dynamics were precarious. The Vinland venture was ultimately a private enterprise, not a state-sponsored expedition, and its failure to persist reflects the inability of a small, isolated group to impose itself permanently on a continent already populated by resilient indigenous societies who had no reason to tolerate intrusion. The decision to abandon the settlement was likely debated around the central hearths of the longhouses, in voices that we cannot hear but whose arguments are echoed in the sparse, final layers of ash. The economic logic that drove the Norse to aux Meadows was fundamentally about resource deficits in the Greenland colony. The Greenlanders, living at the extreme northern margin of European agriculture, faced chronic shortages of wood, iron, and cereal grain. The native vegetation provided only dwarf birch and willow, suitable for small-scale carving and fuel but utterly inadequate for shipbuilding, housing, or the production of charcoal for iron smelting. Driftwood from Siberia, carried on the East Greenland Current, was a vital but unpredictable supplement, and the saga's record that timber was so valuable that disputes over driftwood rights could lead to blood feuds. The lure of Markland, the forested coast of Labrador, was therefore primarily about obtaining timber for construction and boat repair, and the archaeological evidence of woodworking at aux Meadows directly supports this. Beyond wood, the Greenland colony's iron supply was critically dependent on bog iron, which was laborious to smelt and of variable quality, and on expensive imports from Norway that diminished over time as trade routes became less reliable. The smithy at aux Meadows thus represents an attempt to establish an independent iron supply by tapping the bog iron resources of Newfoundland, a strategy that, if successful, could have made the Vinland base a vital supplier to the home colony. The third major economic driver was the acquisition of prestige goods, walrus ivory, furs, and exotic timber, that could be traded back to Iceland and Norway for luxury items and essential supplies. Walrus ivory, in particular, was the main export of the Greenland colony, and the Norse may have explored the Gulf of St. Lawrence in part to find new walrus rookeries or to trade with indigenous hunters who had access to them. The butternuts and grapevines found at the site, while not economic staples, functioned as proof of the fertility of the southern lands and as symbols of the expedition's success, items that would be displayed in the halls of Greenland and recounted in the sagas to enhance the prestige of the participants. The economic failure of Vinland lay not in the absence of resources but in the inability to establish a secure, long-term supply chain given the hostile relations with the indigenous population and the immense geographic distance from the Greenland settlements, which were themselves thinly populated and vulnerable. The two medieval Icelandic texts that preserve the Vinland story, the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red, are literary works of remarkable complexity, and understanding their relationship to the archaeological facts at aux Meadows requires careful source criticism. The Saga of the Greenlanders, preserved in the late 14th century Flateyjarbók manuscript, is generally considered the older and more historically reliable of the two accounts, even though it was written down later than the Saga of Eric the Red, which appears in the 13th century Hawksbach. The Greenlanders saga presents a detailed, multi-voyage narrative, in which Leif Erikson first discovers Vinland on a dedicated expedition, followed by separate trips led by his brother Thorvald, by an Icelander named Thorfinn Eriksson, who failed to reach Vinland, and finally by the wealthy merchant Thorfinn Karlsefni and his wife Gudrid, who attempt to establish a settlement. This multiplication of independent voyages is more plausible archaeologically than the saga of Eric the Red's conflation of all events into a single grand expedition led primarily by Karlsefni. The archaeological record at aux Meadows, with its evidence of multiple ship repair episodes and a relatively short but perhaps multi-year occupation, could accommodate either model, but the detailed differentiation of the crews and their fates in the Greenlanders saga makes it easier to map onto the physical evidence of a base camp used by rotating parties. The saga's specific geographical descriptions, Helgeland as a land of flat stone, Markland as a forested coast with white sand beaches, and Vinland as a place where a river flowed from a lake and wild grapes grew, have been matched with remarkable precision to Baffin Island, the Labrador coast around Hamilton Inlet, and the region near aux Meadows plus the southern Gulf of St. Lawrence. While no medieval author had a satellite's view of the eastern seaboard, the oral tradition that fed into the written sagas clearly preserved a core of genuine geographical observation, transmitted across 2 centuries with enough fidelity that modern archaeologists could use the texts as a search guide. The Saga of Eric the Red, by contrast, is a more consciously crafted literary work that aggrandizes the role of the Skagafrur chieftain family to which Karlsefni belonged, and it incorporates supernatural elements and a stronger narrative arc of Christian triumph. In this version, Leif still discovers Vinland accidentally while returning from Norway, but the real colonizing effort is attributed to Karlsefni, who sets out with 3 ships, 60 men, 5 women, and livestock. The saga provides vivid details of the encounters with the Skrælings, including the famous episode in which a bull frightens the native people and precipitates a battle, and it emphasizes the role of Gudrid as a paragon of Christian womanhood who later becomes the matriarch of a lineage of Icelandic bishops. The saga of Eric the Red also mentions a character named Freydis, Leif's sister, but in this version she is portrayed positively, wielding a sword to frighten off the Skrælings after the men have fled, whereas the Greenlanders saga casts her as a murderous villain. These contradictory portrayals are typical of saga literature, which was shaped by the political and familial interests of the 13th century elite who commissioned the manuscripts. For the archaeologist, the value of the saga of Eric the Red lies less in its literal truth than in the cultural memory it encodes. The fact that the Norse attempted a colony, that they brought livestock, that they traded cloth and milk for furs, and that they eventually retreated in the face of sustained indigenous resistance. Every one of these elements is consistent with the material evidence from aux Meadows, where we see the remains of livestock-associated insects, the spindle whorl attesting to textile work, and the strategic yet ultimately temporary nature of the settlement. Thus, while no single saga detail can be accepted uncritically, the overall congruence between the texts and the archaeological site is strong enough to establish that the Vinland tradition is historical at its core, not mythical. The transmission of the Vinland stories from the 11th to the 13th centuries occurred in a cultural context that blended oral memory, genealogical pride, and the literary conventions of the Icelandic Saga age. The events at aux Meadows and the surrounding coasts were first reported by the participants themselves to their families and neighbors in Greenland and Iceland, and they were likely recited in the form of short narrative poems or structured oral accounts known as frasagnar. Over time, these accounts were embedded in the genealogies of prominent families, notably the descendants of Karlsefni and Gudrid, and were reshaped to emphasize the ancestors' bravery, piety, and connection to the exotic lands across the sea. When the sagas were finally committed to parchment in the 13th century, the writers were working in a golden age of Icelandic literature, producing works that aimed to be both entertaining and edifying, and they freely blended realistic detail with folkloric motifs such as the Uniped, a one-legged creature that shoots an arrow at Thorvald in the Greenlander's saga. The presence of such fantastical elements does not invalidate the historical core any more than the presence of Cyclopes in Homer's Odyssey invalidates the existence of Troy. Rather, it signals that the Vinland voyages had entered the realm of legend, and the job of the modern researcher is to separate the durable geographical and archaeological facts from the narrative embellishments. The butternut shells and the butternut would provide a classic case. The saga does not mention butternuts explicitly, but it does mention grapes, and the butternut serves as an independent archaeobotanical tracer that leads us directly to the same southern region where grapes grow, confirming that the oral tradition had preserved a genuine memory of the terrain even if the specific species were conflated or misremembered. The process of extracting historical data from the sagas has been greatly aided by the development of what might be called saga geography, a discipline that compares the textual sailing directions with actual coasts, currents, and sailing times. Scholars such as Gustav Storm, William Thalbitzer, and later Gwyn Jones and Helge Ingstad himself meticulously reconstructed the possible routes. The Greenlander's saga states that from Helgeland to Markland it was 2 days' sail, and from Markland to Vinland another 2 days with a northeast wind. Modern navigators have confirmed that the distance from the eastern entrance of Hudson Strait, Helgeland, to the coast of central Labrador, Markland, is approximately 300 nautical miles, a plausible 2-day run for an hour. From central Labrador to the northern tip of Newfoundland is another 250 to 300 nautical miles, again 2 days. This remarkable fit between the saga's temporal estimates and the actual distances, when tested with replica vessels, argues that the sailors who originally made these voyages provided accurate, quantitative navigational data that was preserved in the oral tradition. The location of aux Meadows precisely at the point where a ship making this 2-day run would first encounter a sheltered bay with abundant resources is a powerful validation of the saga-guided search method. The saga descriptions of the tides and the landscape at Vinland, the shallow bay that was dry at low tide, the lake behind the settlement, matched aux Meadows in multiple particulars, though some details, such as the salmon run and the lush winter grazing, may reflect a composite memory that includes observations from both the Newfoundland base and the more southerly exploration zones. The archaeology and the text together create a mutually reinforcing evidentiary framework that stands as one of the most successful interdisciplinary reconstructions in historical geography. Since the discovery of aux Meadows, archaeologists have searched intensively for additional Norse sites in North America, driven by the knowledge that a single base camp could not have been the full extent of the Vinland enterprise. The sagas describe multiple landing sites and resource-gathering expeditions, and the butternut evidence from the site proves that the Norse traveled hundreds of kilometers south. This has sparked a series of high-profile investigations, the most publicized of which was the search for a second Norse site at Point Rosie, on the southwestern coast of Newfoundland. In 2015, archaeologist Sarah Parkak, using satellite imagery to detect subtle vegetation patterns indicative of buried structures, identified a promising anomaly at Point Rosie, and preliminary excavations revealed a possible turf wall and what was initially reported as roasted bog iron. The site generated worldwide headlines, and a documentary film crew followed the excavation, raising hopes of a second confirmed Viking settlement. However, subsequent analysis by a team from Memorial University of Newfoundland and Parks Canada, including extensive test pitting, soil chemistry, and radiocarbon dating, concluded that the Point Rosy feature was not Norse but a natural accumulation of iron-rich soil, possibly associated with a later colonial-era occupation. The saga of Point Rosy is a cautionary tale about the difficulty of identifying ephemeral Norse sites in a region where 1,000 years of coastal erosion, permafrost action, and dense vegetation have obscured the archaeological record. It also illustrates the tension between the desire for a major discovery and the rigorous standards of proof that the scientific community rightly demands. While aux Meadows remains the only universally accepted Norse site, the search continues using more sophisticated techniques, including LiDAR, light detection and ranging, to penetrate forest cover, ground-penetrating radar, and the analysis of lake sediment cores for traces of human-induced environmental change. Beyond Newfoundland, the most compelling evidence for additional Norse activity comes from the Canadian Arctic and the coast of Labrador. On Baffin Island, at sites such as Nanook on the southern shore and Tanfield Valley on the southeast coast, archaeologists have identified stone structures that differ markedly from the classic Dorset Paleo-Eskimo winter houses. These structures have rectangular outlines, internal stone-lined hearths, and in some cases, concentrations of spun cordage and worked wood that are not part of the Dorset technological tradition. At Tanfield Valley, also known as the Willows Island site, excavators recovered a piece of smelted metal, a small bronze vessel fragment, and several lengths of two-ply yarn made from the fur of Arctic hare and muskox, spun in a manner identical to Norse textile techniques. The yarn, which has been radiocarbon dated to the 13th or 14th century, is unmistakably European in origin, as the Dorset and Thule peoples of the region did not spin fiber. The presence of these materials in a Dorset context suggests that a sustained trading relationship existed between the Greenland Norse and the Dorset of the High Arctic, with the Norse exchanging metal and textiles for walrus ivory, narwhal tusks, and furs. The Nanook site, excavated by Patricia Sutherland of the Canadian Museum of History, also yielded a small wooden tally stick with cut marks that some interpret as a Norse accounting tool, though this interpretation remains debated. The emerging picture is that the Norse maintained a seasonal presence along the coasts of Baffin Island and northern Labrador for centuries, possibly operating out of temporary camps and trading directly with the Dorset, in what amounted to a northern fur trade network that long predated the Hudson's Bay Company. These Arctic sites are crucial because they demonstrate that aux Meadows was not an isolated outlier but part of a broader pattern of Norse activity across northeastern North America, adapted to different environments and different indigenous cultures. On the coast of Labrador, place names and local traditions have long hinted at a Norse presence, but definitive archaeological evidence has been frustratingly elusive. The area around Hamilton Inlet, identified by many scholars as the Markland of the Sagas, is a vast, heavily forested region with numerous sheltered coves and sandy beaches that would have been ideal for Norse landing and timber extraction. Surveys by Canadian archaeologist Kevin McAleese and others have identified possible Norse-type iron blooms and slag in indigenous contexts, but no settlement comparable to aux Meadows has been found. The acidic soils of Labrador, combined with millennia of repeated occupation by maritime Archaic, Dorset, and Innu peoples, make the preservation and identification of a small, short-term Norse camp exceedingly difficult. Nevertheless, the discovery of a Norse penny from the reign of Olaf Kyrre, 1065-1093, at a Native American site in Maine, known as the Goddard Site, provides independent evidence that Norse artifacts were circulating far south of Newfoundland, likely through indigenous trade networks. The coin, which was perforated for suspension and found in a context dating to the 12th or 13th century, is the only authenticated pre-Columbian Norse artifact found in the territory of the modern United States. It indicates that goods from the Greenland colony were reaching the Gulf of Maine, perhaps via the long-range trading networks of the Algonquian-speaking peoples, and it raises the possibility that the Norse themselves may have explored the coasts of Nova Scotia and New England without leaving a detectable permanent footprint. The Goddard coin, together with the Butternut Trail from aux Meadows, constructs a map of Norse influence that extends at least as far south as the 45th parallel, covering a coastline of over 2,000 kilometers from Baffin Island to Maine, a maritime sphere of activity that was far more extensive than the single excavated settlement at the tip of Newfoundland might suggest. The methodological challenges of finding additional Norse sites in eastern North America are immense, and will require a generational shift in archaeological prospection. Unlike the stone cities of Mesoamerica or the massive earthworks of the Mississippian culture, the Norse presence was ephemeral. A few years of turf buildings that quickly melt back into the landscape, a few kilograms of iron slag dispersed by roots and frost heave, a handful of butternuts that could be mistaken for modern intrusions. The Norse did not build in stone on a monumental scale, and their organic artifacts, wood, wool, bone, survive only in very particular anaerobic conditions. The Ingstad's success was due in part to the exceptional preservation of the cultural layer at aux Meadows, which was capped by a protective layer of peat that kept the soil chemistry relatively neutral. Most other coastal sites in the region have experienced either severe erosion or complete obliteration by later European settlement. To find the next Vinland site, archaeologists are turning to predictive modeling that uses geographic information systems to identify coastal locations with the same combination of features that made aux Meadows attractive: a sheltered gravel beach, a nearby freshwater stream, access to bog iron, a flat terrace above storm surge level, and a viewscape that allows defensive surveillance. These models are then tested with targeted LiDAR surveys and micro-excavations that search for the chemical signature of a Norse smithy, elevated levels of iron, copper, and charcoal in the soil. Environmental DNA analysis of lake sediments is also being deployed to detect spikes in coprophilous fungal spores that would indicate the sudden arrival of grazing animals, a signature that is unmistakably European in a region where domestic livestock did not exist before the 16th century. The hunt for the lost camps of Leif, Thorvald, and Karlsefni is thus entering a new, high-tech phase, and many researchers believe it is only a matter of time before another piece of the Vinland puzzle is uncovered. The encounter between the Norse and the indigenous peoples of the North American Arctic and subarctic is one of the most profound and understudied aspects of the Vinland story, and the archaeological evidence from aux Meadows and its broader region forces us to re-examine the nature of that contact. The term skraeling, used in the sagas to describe the native inhabitants encountered in Vinland, is a blanket designation that likely applied to multiple distinct cultural groups. In Greenland, the Norse used the term for the Dorset Paleoeskimo, whom they encountered in the northern hunting grounds, and later for the Thule ancestors of the modern Inuit, who migrated into the region around the 12th century. In Vinland, the skraelings encountered by Leif, Thorvald, and Karlsefni were most likely the ancestors of the Beothuk, the indigenous people of Newfoundland who were tragically extirpated in the 19th century. Archaeological evidence shows that Newfoundland was occupied at the time of the Norse arrival by a population that had transitioned from the earlier maritime Archaic and Dorset adaptations to a more localized, interior and coast-oriented hunting economy. These people used bow and arrow, harpoon, and spear, lived in small, mobile bands, and had a material culture dominated by stone and bone tools. The saga descriptions of the skraelings emerging from the forest in skin boats, and trading furs for red cloth are entirely consistent with what we know of the Beothuk and their Algonquian-speaking relatives on the mainland. The archaeological invisibility of skraeling artifacts within the aux Meadows settlement itself suggests that the Norse and the indigenous people were in contact, but that the settlement was not a place where they lived together or even engaged in prolonged face-to-face exchange. Instead, encounters may have occurred on the beaches, in the forest, or at neutral sites away from the Norse camp, with goods exchanged at a distance, as was common in many cross-cultural trade situations where mutual distrust was high. The saga account of the Norse leaving out pans of milk as a peace offering, and the skraelings later returning in force, paints a picture of tentative, easily ruptured relations that left no durable archaeological trace beyond the occasional arrowhead or trade bead. The material culture of the Dorset and Thule peoples who interacted with the Norse in the high Arctic and Labrador is better documented, and it reveals a fascinating pattern of technological transfer. At several Dorset sites on Baffin Island, archaeologists have found small pieces of smelted copper and iron, as well as fragments of spun wool and a piece of a bronze bull, all of which are demonstrably of Norse origin. These objects were not simply discarded by passing Norse sailors. They were incorporated into Dorset toolkits, with the metal being cold hammered into small blades and points. The spun wool was used as decorative binding on tools, a practice unknown in indigenous Arctic cultures before contact. In exchange, the Norse obtained the Arctic's most valuable commodity, walrus ivory and narwhal tusk. The Greenland colony's economy was heavily dependent on the export of walrus ivory to Europe, where it was carved into elaborate religious objects, game pieces, and luxury items. The demand for ivory drove the Norse ever deeper into the northern hunting grounds, where they inevitably encountered the Dorset and later the Thule. The relationship appears to have been primarily commercial, though episodes of violence are recorded in the sagas, such as a Norse attack on a group of Skrælings in the northern settlement of Greenland. The archaeological evidence suggests that the Dorset-Norse interaction was sustained for at least 2 centuries, with some Dorset sites containing Norse materials that date as late as the 14th century, after the disappearance of the Norse colonies. This interaction fundamentally altered the material culture of the Dorset, who became dependent on Norse metal for certain tool types, and it may have contributed to the eventual Dorset collapse when the Norse trade goods were no longer available, though this is a matter of ongoing debate. The indigenous perspective on the Norse arrival is, by its very nature, extremely difficult to reconstruct from archaeological evidence alone, but oral traditions and ethnographic analogy provide important clues. The Beothuk, who were the direct descendants of the indigenous inhabitants of Newfoundland at the time of contact, had a strong cultural memory of a people called the Shawnee, or Shandokek, who were described as pale strangers who came from the sea and with whom there was conflict. These traditions, recorded by early European observers in the 18th and 19th centuries, are tantalizing but must be treated with caution, as they may have been influenced by later contact with European fishermen and settlers. Nevertheless, the consistency of the Beothuk oral tradition with the saga accounts, strangers arriving in large boats, initial trade followed by violence, the strangers eventually departing, suggests that a genuine folk memory of the Norse encounter may have survived for over 700 years. On the mainland, Mi'kmaq oral traditions include stories of a white people who came from the east and brought strange objects, though these are even more difficult to disentangle from the early modern European contact period. The indigenous experience of the Norse arrival was surely one of profound shock and disruption, even if the Norse presence was brief. The sudden appearance of metal-armed, bearded men in massive boats would have been an unprecedented event in the history of the region, and the subsequent violence, however limited, would have had a lasting psychological impact. The Norse, in turn, would have perceived the Skrælings as a formidable and alien threat, and the failure to establish a lasting peaceful relationship was the single most important factor in the abandonment of the Vinland colony. The Vinland encounter thus prefigures the entire subsequent history of European indigenous relations in the Americas, but on a small, localized, and ultimately failed scale. The legacy of the Norse indigenous encounter also includes the possibility of genetic and cultural exchange that we are only beginning to uncover. The C1e mitochondrial DNA lineage found in modern Icelanders, which appears to be of Native American origin and dates to around 1000 AD, is the most dramatic piece of biological evidence for contact. If a Native American woman was indeed brought back to Iceland by a Norse expedition, possibly as a captive, a spouse, or a freed slave, her descendants were integrated into the Icelandic gene pool and are now represented by a small but significant fraction of the population. This single genetic strand humanizes the Vinland contact in a way that no artifact can. It tells us that the encounter was not just about trade and violence, but also about the intimate connections that sometimes formed between people from opposite sides of the Atlantic. Additionally, the presence of a few Norse loanwords in the Greenlandic Inuit language, such as the word for cat, katak, has been proposed but remains linguistically controversial. More compelling is the archaeological evidence that the Thule Inuit adopted iron tools from the Norse and later from European whalers, creating a technological tradition that continued into the historic period. The Norse presence in the Arctic and subarctic, though temporary, was the first act in a long drama of cultural contact and transformation that continues to shape the identities of the region's peoples today. The story of aux Meadows, when fully contextualized, is not just a story of European exploration, it is a story of cross-cultural encounter in which both sides were agents, both sides made choices, and both sides left traces that we are still piecing together 1,000 years later. The fate of the Greenland colony and its connection to the Vinland enterprise is a necessary component of understanding why aux Meadows was abandoned and why the Norse never established a permanent foothold in North America. The eastern and western settlements of Greenland were founded in the late 10th century and persisted for nearly 500 years. But by the mid-15th century, all communication with Europe had ceased, and when a Norwegian expedition finally visited the eastern settlement in 1721, it found only ruins and Inuit inhabitants. The causes of the colony's disappearance have been intensely debated, with climate change, economic collapse, cultural rigidity, and conflict with the Inuit all playing roles. The onset of the Little Ice Age around 1300 AD brought colder temperatures, increased sea ice, and shorter growing seasons, making the already marginal Norse agriculture almost untenable. The hay harvests that sustained the cattle and sheep through the long winters failed more frequently, and the crucial summer voyages to the northern hunting grounds for walrus and seal became more dangerous as the sea ice expanded. The Greenlanders, who were heavily dependent on livestock and a European-style diet of dairy and grain, were unable or unwilling to adopt the marine mammal hunting technology and the flexible, seal-based subsistence economy of the Thule Inuit, who had arrived in Greenland in the 12th century and thrived under the same conditions. The Vinland voyages, with their promise of abundant timber, pasture, and iron, can be seen as an attempt to solve the resource deficits that eventually doomed the Greenland colony. But the failure to hold aux Meadows meant that the Greenlanders were forced back on their own dwindling resources. The connection between aux Meadows and the later history of the Greenland colony is illuminated by a single, tantalizing entry in the Icelandic annals for the year 1347. It states, "A ship came from Greenland, smaller in size than the small Icelandic ships. It had sailed to Markland and then was driven off course, and it came into Stromfjord." This brief record proves that the Greenlanders were still making timber-gathering voyages to the Labrador coast, the Markland of the Sagas, nearly 350 years after Leif Erikson's first voyage and 280 years after the abandonment of aux Meadows. The ship was small, crewed by Greenlanders, and it was blown off course to Iceland on its return journey, a fate that underscores the perils of the North Atlantic crossing. The fact that the Greenlanders continued to sail to Markland for timber throughout the 14th century indicates that the aux Meadows base camp was part of a sustained, long-term pattern of resource extraction, not a one-time exploratory venture. The Markland voyages probably went to the heavily forested coasts of central and southern Labrador, where the Norse would beach their ships, cut a cargo of logs, and return without establishing a permanent camp. This seasonal, transient strategy was a pragmatic adaptation to the dangers of indigenous resistance and the difficulty of maintaining a year-round settlement so far from home. aux Meadows, with its well-built halls and smithy, represented an ambitious attempt to create a more permanent infrastructure. But when that failed, the Norse reverted to the lower-risk, lower-investment model of the Markland timber voyage. The archaeological record of aux Meadows therefore captures a moment of maximum effort in the Vinland project, after which the Greenlanders scaled back their ambitions but not their reach. The eventual abandonment of the Greenland colony itself is a tale that mirrors the Vinland retreat on a much larger scale. Excavations at the farm beneath the sand garden under Sandet, in the western settlement, which was buried by glacial outwash and permafrost in the 14th century, have provided a chillingly detailed picture of the colony's final years. The farm's inhabitants butchered their last livestock, including newborn calves that were too precious to slaughter in normal times, and then abandoned the farm, leaving behind their tools, their cloth, and even their personal possessions, as if they intended to return but never did. Isotopic analysis of the human bones from the churchyard shows a progressive shift from a terrestrial, dairy-based diet to a diet heavily dependent on marine mammals in the colony's final decades, indicating a desperate scramble for calories as the pastures failed. The last known written record from the Greenland colony is a letter from the Bishop of Gera dated 1408, concerning a wedding. After that, silence. The colony had essentially starved to death, or its survivors had assimilated into the Inuit hunting bands, or they had attempted to escape on the last remaining ships to Iceland and Norway. The Vinland experiment, though separated by 400 years, was the same colonial story in microcosm, an initial burst of confidence and construction, followed by the realization of environmental and social limits, leading to a strategic withdrawal. aux Meadows is thus not just the first European site in America. It is a pre-echo of the great colonial failures that litter the history of North Atlantic exploration, a reminder that the ability to reach a new world is not the same as the ability to inhabit it permanently. Modern research has also proposed a provocative hypothesis that links the Norse abandonment of Vinland directly to a specific climatic or volcanic event. The dendrochronological pinpoint of 1021 AD places the Norse presence at aux Meadows just after a well-documented global volcanic eruption, possibly of the Brarbunga volcano in Iceland or a more distant tropical volcano, which occurred in 940 AD and caused a temporary cooling event, but no such event aligns precisely with the abandonment. More relevant is the strong likelihood that the 11th century climate, though within the medieval warm period, was variable, and that the Norse experienced a series of unusually harsh winters that made their livestock-dependent economy unsustainable. The saga mentions that during Karlsefni's expedition, much sickness afflicted the crew, and the grazing for the animals was poor. If the Norse encountered a decadal-scale climate oscillation that shortened the growing season, the experiment of year-round settlement would have been rendered marginal even without indigenous hostility. The double stress of a cooling climate and the constant threat of attack would have been enough to tip the cost-benefit calculation decisively toward retreat. The Greenland colony, with its 500-year history, demonstrated that the Norse could survive in the far north if they had a secure home base and seasonal access to resources, but Vinland was too far and too exposed to serve as a permanent home, and the fragile transatlantic connection snapped as soon as the first generation of explorers died and the population pressure in Greenland eased due to attrition and emigration. The ghost of aux Meadows, buried under the grass for 1,000 years, is a monument to a colonial dream that died young, a dream that the Greenlanders could not and did not sustain. The indigenous archaeology of the Great Northern Peninsula and the broader Newfoundland region provides the essential counterpoint to the Norse story and helps to explain why aux Meadows was never more than a fleeting European presence. At the time of the Norse arrival, the island of Newfoundland was inhabited by the ancestors of the Beothuk, a group that had gradually evolved from the earlier maritime archaic tradition through a series of adaptations to the island's interior caribou herds, coastal seal populations, and the abundant salmon runs. The archaeological culture immediately preceding the Norse period is known as the Recent Indian period, dated to roughly 100 BC to 1500 AD, and it is characterized by small, highly mobile family groups who left behind scatters of stone tools, fire-cracked rock from hearths, and the occasional burial site near the coast. Unlike the Dorset and Thule of the Arctic, the recent Indian people of Newfoundland did not use skin boats for open ocean hunting. They relied on birch bark canoes, which were light, maneuverable, and perfectly suited to the rivers and inshore waters. The material culture was almost entirely non-ceramic, with projectile points made from rama chert, a distinctive translucent stone from a quarry in northern Labrador, which was traded over hundreds of kilometers, indicating extensive regional networks. The population density was low, perhaps only a few thousand people on the entire island, but these groups had a profound knowledge of the seasonal cycles of the land and sea, and they would have observed the arrival of the Norse ships with intense curiosity and probably alarm. The massive turf longhouses, the unfamiliar domestic animals, and the smoke from the smithy would have been completely alien, and the indigenous response, as recorded in the sagas, was a mixture of cautious trade and organized defense. The Beothuk tool kit, as reconstructed from historic collections and archaeological sites, was superbly adapted to the boreal environment, but utterly different from the iron-based technology of the Norse. Bows made of spruce or birch, strung with caribou sinew, fired arrows tipped with finely chipped stone points and fletched with feathers, weapons that were highly effective at close range in woodland ambushes. The Beothuk also used harpoons with detachable heads for sealing, and multi-barbed fishing spears for salmon, but none of these tools employed metal. The concept of smelting iron would have been entirely outside their experience, and the initial trade items that the Norse offered, red woolen cloth, milk, and possibly small iron blades, would have been exotic novelties that were rapidly incorporated into existing value systems. The sagas note that the Skrælings were particularly eager to obtain the red cloth, which they tied around their heads as a decoration, and that they would trade any number of furs for a strip of it. This asymmetrical valuation is a classic pattern in cross-cultural trade. The indigenous people saw the cloth as a powerful, aesthetically striking item of prestige, while the Norse saw the furs as valuable trade goods that could be sold in Europe. The moment of violent rupture, when the bull panicked the Skrælings, indicates that the two groups had no shared understanding of domesticated livestock. The animal was a terrifying monster to people who had never seen a cow, and its sudden appearance shattered the fragile trust that had been established. The saga account of a Skræling being killed for stealing weapons also suggests that the Norse were quick to use force to protect what they saw as their superior technology, a pattern that would be repeated tragically across the Americas in later centuries. The archaeological evidence of Norse indigenous interaction at the scale of the entire Newfoundland landscape is subtle but present. A small number of Dorset and recent Indian sites in the Strait of Belle Isle region have yielded fragments of iron that predate the 16th century European contact period. These include iron nails and blades that could be Norse, though the secure contextual dating of these finds is often problematic. At the Dorset site of Port O'Shoy, on the west coast of Newfoundland's northern peninsula, excavators found a small piece of smelted iron in a layer dating to the 11th century, though it could have been traded down the coast from the Norse camp. The presence of exotic stone materials, such as the Greenland soapstone used for the spindle whorl at aux Meadows, also worked in reverse. The Norse may have collected local stone types as curiosities, and a few pieces of Rama chert have been found in Greenlandic Norse contexts, suggesting a two-way exchange of lithic materials. These scanty but significant finds indicate that the Norse and indigenous peoples were not completely isolated from each other. They were part of a contact zone that extended from the tip of Newfoundland deep into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The overall picture is of a cautious, low-intensity interaction that allowed for limited trade and exchange of materials but never bridged the cultural chasm sufficiently to prevent violence and, ultimately, Norse retreat. The indigenous people, for their part, seemed to have treated the Norse as a temporary intrusion, and after the settlement was abandoned, the Beothuk ancestors continued to occupy the region, their way of life largely unchanged until the arrival of European fishermen in the 16th century began a far more devastating phase of contact. The legacy of the Norse visit on the indigenous populations of Newfoundland is a topic of both scholarly debate and deep emotional resonance. For the Beothuk, who were driven to extinction in 1829 by disease, displacement, and violence at the hands of European settlers, the question of whether the Norse left any genetic or cultural legacy is poignant but archaeologically unresolved. No human remains from the Beothuk have been DNA tested for Norse admixture, and the oral traditions that speak of pale strangers are too fragmentary to confirm. The tragic irony is that the Norse, who failed to colonize Vinland, were the harbingers of a European presence that would eventually consume the very people who resisted them. From the indigenous perspective, the Vinland episode is not a story of heroic exploration but a small, early episode in a long history of colonial intrusion, and the memory of that encounter, if it survives at all, is woven into the fabric of resistance and resilience that characterizes the indigenous people of the North Atlantic today. The archaeological site at aux Meadows, managed in partnership with indigenous communities, now serves as a place where this difficult history can be told from multiple perspectives, ensuring that the story of the Skrælings is not forgotten in the celebration of Viking achievement. The cartographic and literary afterlife of Vinland before the 20th century archaeological confirmation is a fascinating study in how a kernel of historical truth can be transmitted, distorted, and sometimes entirely lost in the cultural memory of Europe. In the immediate aftermath of the Vinland voyages, the news of a land to the west circulated in the ecclesiastical and seafaring communities of Scandinavia and northern Germany. Around 1075, the chronicler Adam of Bremen, writing in his Gesta Hammerbergensis Ecclesi Pontificum, reported that King Sweyn II of Denmark had told him of an island in the ocean called Vinland because grapes grow there wild, producing the best of wine, and that there is also grain self-sown, and we know this not from fable but from the reliable report of the Danes. This passage, which explicitly rejects the idea that Vinland is mythical, is the earliest written evidence outside of Iceland and shows that the discovery was known in the highest circles of European learning. Adam's source was the Danish king, who had himself been informed by the Norse sailors who came to his court, and the detail about self-sown grain and grapes aligns perfectly with the saga descriptions of wildline grass and the grape harvests of Vinland. However, after Adam's time, the knowledge of Vinland in continental Europe began to fade. The 13th century Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson, in his Heimskringla, mentions Vinland only in passing, and the land appears sporadically in Icelandic annals and geographical treatises. But as the centuries passed and the Greenland colony declined, Vinland became a semi-mythical place in the European imagination, conflated with the Antilles, the Fortunate Isles, and other fantastical lands in the Western Ocean. The rediscovery of the Vinland sagas during the Renaissance and Enlightenment era triggered a new wave of cartographic and literary speculation. In 1570, the Flemish cartographer Abraham Ortelius published his Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, one of the first modern atlases, which included a map of the North Atlantic showing a region labeled Estodolanda, and a note mentioning that the Norse had discovered a land called Vinland. Ortelius had access to Icelandic sources and to the geographical compilations of the Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus, and his map represents the first serious attempt to place Vinland on a scientific map of the New World. The Swedish scholar Olaus Magnus, in his 1539 Carta Marina, depicted the North Atlantic with sea monsters and a large island called Tile, that some associate with Vinland, though the identification is speculative. In 1705, the Icelandic historian Thormodus Torfius published Historia Vinlandi Antiqui, which gathered all the saga references and argued forcefully that Vinland was a real place located somewhere on the coast of North America. Torfius's work was read by the American polymath Cotton Mather, who in his Magnalia Christi Americana of 1702 entertained the possibility that the Norse had preceded Columbus. By the 19th century, the Vinland hypothesis had become a subject of intense popular interest and scholarly debate, with the proliferation of theories locating Vinland in every conceivable location from Newfoundland to Florida, often based on dubious archaeological claims and racial nationalist ideologies. The Kensington runestone, discovered in Minnesota in 1898 and purporting to be a record of a Norse expedition in 1362, was one of many hoaxes that exploited the Vinland mythos and contributed to the skepticism of mainstream historians. The literary reception of Vinland in the 19th and early 20th centuries was shaped by the Romantic movement and its fascination with the Vikings as noble savages and proto-discoverers. Poets like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, in his The Skeleton in Armor, 1841, wove the Vinland story into a tragic romance of a Viking lover who builds a stone tower in Newport for his beloved. The poem, though based on the spurious Newport Tower, popularized the idea of a Viking presence in New England and influenced the public imagination for generations. In Norway, the Vinland voyages became a cornerstone of national identity during the struggle for independence from Sweden, and the Norwegian polar explorer Fridtjof Nansen, though skeptical of the saga details, used the Vinland story as an example of Norse maritime prowess in his 1911 work. In Northern Mists, the Icelandic sagas themselves were translated into English and widely read, with the Greenlander saga and the saga of Eric the Red becoming part of the canon of world literature and inspiring countless novels, including the mid-20th century Vinland series by the American historical novelist Edison Marshall. The pre-existing literary fascination with Vinland created a receptive audience for the Ingstad's discovery in 1960, and the archaeological confirmation of the saga narrative was perceived by many as a vindication of the idea that literature and myth can preserve genuine historical memory. The site at aux Meadows thus bridged the gap between the romantic literary tradition and the hard evidence of science, a conjunction that is exceptionally rare and accounts for the deep emotional impact of the discovery. The modern mapping of the Vinland voyages has been revolutionized by the synthesis of saga geography, archaeology, and paleo-environmental data. Scholars now speak of a Vinland region that encompasses the entire Gulf of St. Lawrence and its river systems, with aux Meadows serving as the gateway station, the hop of the sagas located somewhere in the Miramichi Bay or the Baie des Chalets, and Markland firmly identified as the forested coast of central Labrador. The Butternut Trail has been augmented by the mapping of wild grape distribution at the time, using palynology and historical ecology, which shows that grapes grew along the south shore of the St. Lawrence and in the river valleys of New Brunswick during the medieval warm period. The recovery of a single butternut hull from an archaeological context in Nova Scotia, dated to the 11th century and found in association with a possible Norse-type iron object, though not yet fully verified, hints that the exploration may have reached as far as the Annapolis Valley. The precision of the 1021 dendrochronological date from aux Meadows has spurred a new cartographic initiative called the Norse Atlantic Mapping Project, which aims to reconstruct the exact coastlines, sea levels, and sailing routes of the 11th century. Sea level rise of approximately 0.5 to 1 meter since the Viking Age means that some landing sites are now submerged, and the project is using bathymetric sonar to search for possible stone anchors, ballast piles, and ship remains in the shallow waters of the Gulf. The map of Vinland is thus still being drawn, and each new piece of data, a pollen grain, a timber fragment, a chemical signature in a lake core, adds a line to the cartography of a lost world that existed for a brief, bright moment at the turn of the millennium. The experimental archaeology and living history programs associated with aux Meadows have transformed the abstract archaeological record into a tangible, sensory experience that has deepened our understanding of the Norse way of life in Vinland. The full-scale replica site, built by Parks Canada in the late 1970s and continuously updated, consists of 3 reconstructed turf longhouses, a smithy, and a storage hut, all constructed using the same materials and techniques documented in the excavation. The buildings were erected by a team of archaeologists, historians, and local craftsmen who cut turf from a nearby bog, shaped spruce timbers with replica iron axes, and assembled the walls and roofs using only the methods available to 11th century Norse settlers. The process of building these replicas was itself an experiment that revealed how much labor and skill was required. Constructing Hall A, with its 250 square meter footprint, took a team of 8 people 6 weeks of continuous work, using an estimated 10,000 turfs and 50 cubic meters of timber. The experience confirmed that the Norse would have needed to establish a reliable supply chain of tools, food, and labor to complete such a structure, and that the construction likely occurred during the summer months when the ground was thawed and the workforce was available. The interior of the replica hall, with its long central hearth, raised earthen benches, and low, smoke-filled ceiling, provides visitors with a visceral sense of what daily life was like. The constant smell of peat smoke, the dim light filtered through the smoke hole, the warmth of the fire, and the cramped, communal sleeping arrangements. This immersive environment has proven to be one of the most effective educational tools for conveying the reality of the Vinland settlement to a non-specialist audience. The smithy replica has been the site of intensive experimental iron smelting campaigns, led by archaeometallurgists and traditional blacksmiths. Using locally collected bog iron ore from the same deposits the Norse exploited, the team has repeatedly demonstrated that the Norse furnace technology was capable of producing high-quality iron blooms on the Newfoundland coast. The process involved roasting the ore over an open fire to crack the nodules and drive off water, then building a small clay-lined shaft furnace and charging it with alternating layers of charcoal and roasted ore. A double-bag bellows, operated by 2 people, delivered a continuous air blast that raised the temperature to approximately 1,250 degrees Celsius, sufficient to reduce the iron oxide to metallic iron while the silica and other impurities melted into a glassy slag. The resulting bloom, a spongy mass of iron and trap slag, was then consolidated by repeated heating and hammering on a stone anvil. One experiment in 2010 produced a 2.3 kilogram bloom, which was then forged into a dozen square section rivets identical to those found in the archaeological excavation. The entire process, from collecting the ore to finishing the rivets, took about 40 hours of labor and consumed over 50 kilograms of charcoal. These experiments have demonstrated not only the technical feasibility of the operation but also the sheer amount of woodland needed to fuel the smithy. The charcoal production alone would have required the felling and processing of dozens of trees, contributing to the deforestation that is visible in the pollen record around aux Meadows. The experimental work has also clarified the skill level of the Norse smiths, who were able to control the carbon content of the iron by adjusting the air flow and the charcoal ratio, producing both soft iron for rivets and slightly harder steel for tool edges. The most ambitious experimental archaeology projects associated with Vinland have been the replica ship voyages that have retraced the Norse route from Greenland to Newfoundland. In 1991, the replica Nar, Gaia, built in Norway, sailed from Bergen to Greenland and then to aux Meadows, making the crossing in stages over 2 summers. The voyage demonstrated that a Nar could indeed make the transatlantic passage using only the navigational tools available to the Norse, though the crew encountered severe storms and ice that underscored the danger of the journey. In 2000, to mark the millennium of Leif Erikson's voyage, a replica longship named Islandinger sailed from Iceland to Greenland and then to aux Meadows, arriving in August of that year to a celebration attended by thousands, including the Prime Minister of Iceland and officials from Canada and Norway. The Islandinger voyage confirmed the sailing times mentioned in the sagas and provided a dramatic visual spectacle that captured the world's imagination. More recently, the Draken Harald Harfiger, a replica longship built in Norway, crossed the North Atlantic in 2016 and visited multiple ports in the United States and Canada, including a stop at aux Meadows, where the crew paid homage to the Ingstads and the Viking explorers. These voyages are not merely stunts. They are rigorous experiments that test the seaworthiness of the clinker-built hull, the efficiency of the square sail, the reliability of the steering oar, and the physical and psychological endurance of the crew. The data collected on speed, leeway drift, fuel consumption, in terms of food and water, and the performance of woolen clothing and footwear has been invaluable in understanding the human dimension of the Vinland voyages. The living history interpretation at aux Meadows has also extended to the domestic sphere, with costumed interpreters demonstrating wool spinning, wood carving, cooking, and storytelling in the replica halls. The reproduction of Norse clothing, based on textile fragments from the site and from Greenland and Iceland, has revealed the sophistication of the 11th century wardrobe: layers of woolen tunics, linen underdresses, and cloaks fastened with ring-headed pins, all colored with natural dyes derived from local plants. The food served in the replica hall is based on the zooarchaeological and archaeobotanical evidence: seal stew, roast caribou, wild berry compote, and flatbread made from ground wild lime grass seeds and imported barley flour. These culinary reconstructions have provided a direct sensory link to the Norse diet and have highlighted the importance of wild plant gathering, which was previously underestimated in scholarly accounts of Norse subsistence. The interpreters also demonstrate the use of soapstone lamps, which burn seal oil and produce a soft, sooty light, and the carving of wooden spoons, bowls, and gaming pieces, the latter a reminder that the Norse, even on the edge of the known world, brought their board games with them. On the Fatafel board, the Viking chess-like game, has been found in Norse Greenland and is believed to have been a popular pastime during the long winter evenings, and its presence in the replica hall invites visitors to imagine the mental life of the settlers, who whiled away the dark hours with strategy games while the wind howled outside. The entire living history program at aux Meadows is a sustained, immersive experiment in reconstructing the daily rhythms of a lost world, and it has become a model for heritage interpretation around the globe. The genetic evidence for pre-Columbian contact between the Norse and Native Americans, focused on the Icelandic C1e mitochondrial DNA lineage, is one of the most remarkable scientific outcomes of the Vinland research. In 2010, a team of geneticists led by Sunna Ebenezersdottir and Kari Stephenson at Decode Genetics in Iceland published a study in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology identifying a specific mitochondrial haplogroup, C1e, in about 80 living Icelanders. Mitochondrial DNA is passed exclusively from mother to child, and this lineage was completely absent from the European gene pool. Its closest relatives were found among Native American and some East Asian populations. By analyzing the number of mutations that had accumulated in the Icelandic C1e lineage since its divergence from the American C1 lineages, the researchers estimated that the last common ancestor lived around 1000 AD, with a 95% confidence interval spanning the 8th to 13th centuries. This date window coincides precisely with the Vinland voyages, making it overwhelmingly likely that a Native American woman was brought to Iceland by a returning Norse expedition. The woman could have been a captive, a voluntary companion, or a freed slave. The sagas mention that Karlsefni's expedition captured 2 Skraeling children and took them back to Greenland, and it is entirely plausible that a similar event occurred on another voyage, resulting in an adult woman ending up in Iceland. The low frequency of the C1e lineage today indicates that the population was founded by a single woman, or a small number of closely related women, whose descendants integrated into the Icelandic population over many generations. This single genetic thread is, in a very real sense, the living blood of Vinland, a trace of the encounter that has persisted in the bodies of modern Icelanders for 1,000 years. The genetic discovery has profound implications for our understanding of the Vinland contact. It moves the story from the realm of archaeology and text into the biological inheritance of humanity, proving that the encounter was not just a clash of weapons and trade goods but an intimate meeting that resulted in the transfer of genes across the Atlantic. The identity of the Native American woman is, of course, unknown, and we can only speculate about her life. She would have been a member of the indigenous population of the Vinland region, perhaps a Beothuk woman from Newfoundland, or more likely a woman from the Mi'kmaq or other Algonquian groups of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, given that the voyages that returned with captives or companions probably sailed south into the more densely populated areas. Her experience, whether as a wife, a concubine, or a servant, would have been one of extreme dislocation, torn from her homeland and family and transported to an utterly alien environment of ice-capped fjords, turf houses, and Norse language and customs. Yet she survived and had at least one daughter, who in turn passed on her mitochondrial DNA. The genetic data cannot tell us whether her integration was forced or voluntary, but the fact that her lineage survived in the Icelandic population indicates that she was not an isolated outcast. She became part of the family structure of the Norse settlers. This human story, hidden in the DNA, is a powerful counterpoint to the narrative of conflict and retreat that dominates the saga accounts, and it reminds us that the Vinland voyages were a fully human encounter, with all the complexity of affection, violence, and cultural exchange that such encounters entail. The search for genetic traces of Norse contact in Native American populations has been more challenging, partly because the Norse presence was so brief and partly because the subsequent European colonization of the Americas introduced European genes on a massive scale, making it difficult to distinguish an 11th century Norse admixture from 16th century and later admixture. However, some genetic studies of the Inuit populations of Greenland and the eastern Canadian Arctic have identified European haplotypes that could potentially predate the modern colonial period, though the evidence is currently ambiguous. The Thule Inuit, who replaced the Dorset in the Arctic around the 13th century, interacted with the Greenland Norse for several centuries and may have incorporated some Norse individuals into their communities. The Norse themselves are known to have assimilated into the Inuit population in the final years of the Greenland colony, as the archaeological evidence of mixed material culture at some late period sites attests, and their genes would have been absorbed into the Greenlandic Inuit gene pool. Modern Greenlandic Inuit carry a variety of European genetic markers, But teasing apart the 18th century Danish and Whaler contributions from the medieval Norse contributions is a formidable statistical problem that will require the sequencing of ancient DNA from pre-contact and early contact Inuit remains. Such studies are underway, and they hold the promise of revealing a genetic landscape of the North Atlantic that reflects centuries of intermittent contact and exchange before Columbus. Beyond genetics, the linguistic traces of Norse indigenous contact have been sought with limited success. A handful of proposed Norse loanwords in the Greenlandic Inuit language, such as katak for cat, sava for sheep, and nisa for porpoise, have been debated by linguists for decades. The problem is that these words could equally have been borrowed from Danish during the colonial period, as the Danish also brought cats, sheep, and porpoise hunting terminology. The linguistic evidence for Norse influence on the Beotic language is almost non-existent, as the Beotic language was poorly recorded before its extinction, with only a few hundred words preserved in the notes of 19th century ethnographers. The possibility of Norse place names surviving in the indigenous toponymy of Newfoundland and Labrador has intrigued researchers, but no convincing examples have been identified. The most plausible linguistic trace is actually in the opposite direction. The Norse term, skraeling, which was applied to all indigenous peoples of the Americas, entered the Icelandic and Norwegian lexicon and was used in later medieval sources to refer to the Inuit of Greenland. The word itself may derive from an Old Norse root meaning wretch or weakling, but it could also be an onomatopoeic rendering of an indigenous self-designation, perhaps related to the Innu word askaru, meaning person. If so, the word skraeling would be the first American word to enter the European lexicon, a linguistic fossil of the Vinland encounter. The search for further genetic and linguistic evidence of Norse indigenous contact is one of the most exciting frontiers in Vinland studies, and it promises to rewrite the history of the Atlantic world as a story of continuous, if sporadic, human connection rather than a single moment of discovery. The methodology that Helge and Anne Stine Ingstad employed to find and excavate aux Meadows has become a textbook case in archaeological prospection and interdisciplinary collaboration, and its details are worth examining closely for what they reveal about how a major discovery is made. Helge Ingstad's search strategy was founded on a simple but powerful principle: read the sagas as a geographical document, not as literature, and then go to the places that fit the description and ask the local people. This ethnoarchaeological approach, in which the knowledge of indigenous and local communities is treated as a primary source, was ahead of its time in the 1950s, and it directly led to the encounter with George Decker, the fisherman who showed Ingstad the overgrown mounds at aux Meadows. Decker and other residents of the area had always called these mounds the Old Indian Camp, a category into which they placed all prehistoric remains. But Ingstad's training in Norse archaeology allowed him to see that the rectangular shape and the type of wall collapse were unlike any known indigenous site. The moment of recognition, when the local category was reclassified by the expert eye, is a classic demonstration of the importance of integrating local and scientific knowledge. Ingstad then proceeded with a series of test trenches that were strategically placed to reveal the maximum information with minimal disturbance, a technique he had refined during his years of wilderness exploration. The discovery of the iron slag and the bronze pin in those first test squares was the payoff of a method that combined wide-ranging reconnaissance with rapid, targeted testing, a model of efficient archaeological survey. Anne Stine Ingstad's excavation methodology at aux Meadows was a model of Scandinavian archaeological rigor, adapted to the challenging conditions of the Newfoundland coast. She approached the site with the same meticulous single-context recording techniques that had been developed for the excavation of Viking Age towns like Koppang and Hedeby. Each turf block removed, each stone uncovered, and each artifact fragment was plotted in 3 dimensions on a 1/20 scale plan, and every stratigraphic layer was drawn in section. The turf walls, which were structurally complex with their alternating layers of sod and birch bark, were excavated by carefully following the original construction lines, peeling back the collapsed material to reveal the original wall faces and the floor surfaces. This painstaking method allowed the team to distinguish between the original living floor, the collapsed debris, and the later intrusive animal burrows and root disturbances, producing a stratigraphic sequence that was legible decades later to researchers re-examining the records. Anne Stine also implemented a rigorous soil sampling protocol, taking column samples from the hearths, middens, and floor areas for flotation and botanical analysis, a practice that was far ahead of most North American excavations of the 1960s. The recovery of tiny seeds, insect remains, and micro-charcoal was possible because she insisted on processing all excavated sediment through fine mesh screens, a labor-intensive procedure that was not yet standard in the field. Her insistence on integrating the natural sciences into the excavation, through the involvement of palynologists, zoologists, and metallurgists, established a multidisciplinary model that is now standard in world archaeology. The publication of the full excavation report, in 2 volumes and in both Norwegian and English, remains the foundational document for all subsequent research at the site. The Ingstad's success was also due to their skill in navigating the institutional and political landscape of mid-20th century Canadian archaeology. When they first approached the National Museum of Canada with their discovery, the response was skeptical but not hostile. The museum's archaeologists, including Richard McNeish and William Taylor, were open to the possibility but demanded rigorous proof. Helge Ingstad's diplomatic background. He had served as governor of Erik the Red's land and had connections to the Norwegian and Canadian governments, helped him secure the necessary permits and funding for a multi-year excavation, while Anne Stine's academic reputation as an archaeologist lent credibility to the fieldwork. The Ingstads were also adept at managing media interest, recognizing that public support could create political momentum for the site's preservation. Helge's 1964 book, Westward to Vinland, translated into multiple languages, introduced the discovery to a global audience and generated a groundswell of support that led to the Canadian government's designation of aux Meadows as a National Historic Site in 1968, immediately after the excavation concluded. The Ingstad's approach to public archaeology, making the site accessible while protecting the buried remains, set a precedent for how archaeological discoveries should be communicated to the world. Their legacy is not only the site itself but the demonstration that rigorous science and popular engagement can and must go hand in hand. The professional partnership of Helge and Anne Stine Ingstad, which blended Helge's visionary exploration with Anne Stine's exacting scientific method, was crucial to the success of the Vinland project, and it stands as a model of collaborative research that transcends gender roles of their era. Helge was the charismatic idea man, the writer and the communicator, while Anne Stine was the meticulous field director, the analyst, and the author of the definitive archaeological report. Contemporaries noted that they were a true team, with Helge fully deferring to Anne Stine on all archaeological matters, and Anne Stine supporting Helge's broader historical interpretations. Their daily life during the excavation seasons was one of extreme physical hardship. They lived in a small tent and later a trailer at the site, cooked over an open fire, and endured the fog, rain, and black flies of a Newfoundland summer, all while managing a crew of up to 20 students and volunteers. Anne Stine, in particular, faced the challenge of being a woman leading a major archaeological excavation in the 1960s, a time when field archaeology was overwhelmingly male-dominated. She earned the respect of her crew through sheer competence, and her published work was so rigorous that it silenced the initial skeptics. The story of the Ingstads is, in itself, a chapter of the Vinland saga, and the replica longhouse at aux Meadows contains a modest exhibit dedicated to their memory, featuring their field notebooks, photographs, and a letter from George Decker. The discovery of Vinland, like the settlement itself, was a human undertaking, powered by curiosity, love, and a stubborn refusal to give up on an idea that everyone else thought was a myth. The role of women in the Vinland voyages, as preserved in the sagas and illuminated by the archaeological record, is an essential dimension of the story that has often been marginalized in older, adventure-centric accounts. The sagas name several women who were central to the Vinland enterprise: Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, the wife of Thorfinn Karlsefni, who is portrayed as a woman of remarkable beauty, wisdom, and Christian piety; Freydis Eriksdóttir, Leif's half-sister, who is depicted either as a fearless heroine or a murderous villainess depending on the saga version, and Jodhild, Eric the Red's wife and Leif's mother, who was responsible for building the first church in Greenland. Archaeological evidence for the presence of women at aux Meadows is concentrated in the artifacts associated with textile work, domestic management, and personal adornment. The soapstone spindle whorl found in Hall C is the single most definitive marker of a female presence, because in Norse culture spinning was an exclusively female activity, carrying deep symbolic and practical importance. The wool spun at the settlement would have been used to repair clothing and, critically, to mend the ship's sails, making the work of the women as essential to the expedition's survival as the men's ironworking and hunting. The bone needles, the woven cloth fragment, and the amber and jet beads all reinforce the picture of a community in which women were actively engaged in the full range of domestic and artisanal tasks, maintaining the cultural fabric of Norse life on the far shore of the Atlantic. Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir emerges from the sagas as one of the most remarkable figures of the Vinland story, and her biography, which spans the conversion of Iceland to Christianity, the settlement of Greenland, the attempted colonization of Vinland, and a pilgrimage to Rome, encapsulates the entire Saga age. According to the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red, Gudrid was born in Iceland around 980 AD, the daughter of a chieftain, and she was raised in a Christian household. She traveled to Greenland with her first husband, who died shortly after arrival, and then married the merchant Thorfinn Karlsefni, with whom she led the largest Vinland expedition. During their time in Vinland, Gudrid gave birth to a son named Snorri, who is celebrated in the sagas as the first European child born in the New World. Snorri Thorfinnsson lived to a great age in Iceland, and the sagas proudly trace the lineage of Icelandic bishops back to him, making Gudrid the matriarch of a line that shaped the cultural and religious history of the island. After Karlsefni's death, Gudrid made a pilgrimage to Rome, an extraordinary journey for an elderly Icelandic woman in the 11th century, and upon her return, she became a nun and lived the rest of her life as a hermit in her son's household. The archaeological trace of Gudrid at aux Meadows is, of course, intangible, but the soapstone spindle whorl, the Christian-style interment of the structures, and the evidence of a family-scale occupation with children, suggested by the adolescent tooth and the small-sized leather shoe fragment, all align with the saga's portrayal of a domestic, multi-generational community. The story of Gudrid and Snorri humanizes the Vinland settlement in a profound way, transforming it from a military camp into a home where a child was born and a family attempted to put down roots. Freydis Eriksdóttir, the half-sister of Leif Erikson, is the most controversial and vividly drawn female character in the Vinland sagas, and her story challenges modern assumptions about the roles and behaviors of Norse women. In the Saga of the Greenlanders, Freydis organizes her own Vinland expedition in partnership with two brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi, and after a series of disputes, she orchestrates the murder of the brothers and their entire party, personally killing the 5 women with an axe when the men of her own party refuse to do so. The saga presents this act not with unqualified condemnation but with a sense of awe at her ruthlessness, and it notes that Leif refused to punish her because she was his sister, though he predicted that her descendants would not prosper. In the Saga of Eric the Red, Freydis appears in a more heroic light, scaring off a skraeling attack by pulling a sword from a fallen man's hand and slapping it against her bare breast, causing the attackers to flee in terror. These two portrayals, one villainous and one heroic, reflect the complex ways in which strong women were depicted in medieval Norse literature, where female agency was both admired and feared. From an archaeological perspective, the presence of a woman of Freydis' status at aux Meadows would be consistent with the evidence of a high-status female burial or the deposition of valuable personal items, though no such burial has been found. The saga accounts of Freydis' independent command of a ship and her willingness to use violence also highlight the fact that Norse women, particularly those of chieftain rank, could exercise considerable authority and were not confined to purely domestic roles. The story of Freydis, whether historically true or a literary creation, enriches the Vinland narrative by providing a model of female leadership and transgression that challenges the stereotype of the passive medieval woman. The material culture of the women at aux Meadows, as inferred from the artifact assemblage, was oriented around the maintenance of the household, the production of textiles, and the care of children and animals. The spindle whorl and the sewing needles represent the tip of a much larger iceberg of textile work, which would have included the washing, carding, and spinning of wool, the weaving of cloth on a warp-weighted loom, and the cutting and stitching of garments. The clothing worn by the women at the site would have been a layered ensemble of a woolen dress, a linen underdress, a woolen shawl, and leather shoes, all fastened with brooches and pins. The chemical analysis of the cloth fragment from the site indicates that it was dyed with a plant-based dye, possibly woad or madder, producing a blue or red color that would have been a mark of status and femininity. The amber bead and the jet fragment found in the domestic areas suggest that the women adorned themselves with jewelry that carried both aesthetic and amuletic significance, connecting them to the protective symbols of the Norse pagan past even as the community was officially Christian. The care of children is indicated by the adolescent tooth and by the small-sized leather shoe fragment, which was found in the midden and is consistent with the footwear of a child of about 8 to 10 years of age. The presence of children at a frontier settlement underscores the seriousness of the colonization attempt. The Norse brought their families because they intended to stay. The eventual decision to leave must have been especially wrenching for the women, who had built homes, borne children, and woven the fabric of community in a place that was supposed to be their future. The women of Vinland, named and unnamed, were the heart of the colony, and their story is an inseparable part of the site's history. The environmental and climatic context of the Vinland voyages is a crucial factor that shaped both the Norse decision to sail west and the ultimate failure of the colony. The period from roughly 950 to 1250 AD is known as the medieval warm period, a time when northern hemisphere temperatures were, on average, 0.5 to 1 degree Celsius warmer than the subsequent Little Ice Age. In the North Atlantic, this warming reduced the extent and thickness of sea ice, opened up the Davis Strait and the waters around Greenland to easier navigation, and extended the growing season in marginal farming areas. The Norse colonization of Greenland in the 980s was made possible by a window of relatively mild climate that allowed the settlers to establish hayfields, graze cattle and sheep, and navigate the sea routes from Iceland and Norway. The same climatic window enabled the Vinland voyages, because the sea crossing from the western settlement of Greenland to the coast of Baffin Island and Labrador was shorter and less ice-encumbered than it would be in later centuries. The palynological evidence from the peat bogs around aux Meadows shows that during the 11th century, the local climate was warm enough to support a rich herbaceous flora, with abundant grass and sedge, and that the tree line was slightly higher than at present, providing more timber for the settlers. The presence of wild grape pollen in the peat cores confirms that the northern limit of Vitis riparia extended into the Strait of Belle region during this warm phase, making the Sagas' claim of grapes in Vinland environmentally plausible. The Norse arrived at a climatic high point, and their positive impressions of the land, its lush meadows, abundant berries, and navigable waters, were colored by conditions that would not last. The deterioration of the climate with the onset of the Little Ice Age, beginning around 1250 to 1300 AD and intensifying through the 15th century, had a devastating effect on the North Atlantic Norse colonies. Sea ice advanced southward along the east coast of Greenland, making the voyage from Iceland increasingly hazardous and cutting the Greenland settlements off from European trade and communication. The growing season shortened, and the hayfields that sustained the cattle and sheep became less productive, leading to a progressive nutritional crisis. The Norse diet shifted from terrestrial to marine resources, as the isotopic analysis of skeletons shows, but this adaptation was insufficient to save the colony. The Vinland voyages, which had occurred during the climatic optimum, could not be sustained as the climate worsened, because the crossing became more dangerous and the marginal cost of maintaining a remote settlement increased. The abandonment of aux Meadows after only a few years of occupation, well before the full onset of the Little Ice Age, was primarily due to social and political factors, indigenous resistance, and the small population base in Greenland, but the later inability of the Greenlanders to mount new colonization efforts was climate-driven. By the time the 14th century Greenlanders were making timber voyages to Markland, They were using smaller ships and taking greater risks, and the final loss of the Greenland colony in the 15th century extinguished the last Norse outpost in the western Atlantic. The Vinland experiment, seen in this long ecological perspective, was a fleeting success of the medieval warm period, a colony that bloomed in a climatic window that was already closing, leaving the isolated Greenland settlement to slowly freeze and starve while the memory of the fertile land to the west faded into legend. The landscape around aux Meadows itself has changed significantly since the 11th century, due to both natural processes and human activity. Sea level rise of approximately 0.5 to 1 meter has submerged the lower portions of the original beach and may have covered archaeological deposits in the intertidal zone, including possible boat docks or slipways. The coastal erosion of the raised marine terrace, where the settlement sits, is ongoing, and Parks Canada has implemented erosion control measures to protect the site from storm surges. The vegetation has also shifted. The spruce and fir forest that the Norse used for timber has expanded and contracted in response to climate oscillations and, more recently, to commercial logging, and the peat bogs have continued to accumulate, burying the ancient ground surface deeper over time. The palynological and sedimentological studies of the bogs adjacent to the site have provided a high-resolution environmental history that not only documents the brief Norse occupation but also records the much longer trajectory of indigenous land use and natural ecological change. The site is thus not only an archaeological resource but a paleo-environmental archive that allows scientists to reconstruct the climatic and ecological conditions that shape the human history of the region. The integration of this environmental data with the archaeological record is one of the great achievements of the interdisciplinary research program at aux Meadows, and it provides a model for how we can understand the complex interplay of human and natural systems at other early colonial sites around the world. The broader implications of the climate-Vinland connection for the study of human migration and colonization are significant. The Vinland experiment demonstrates that even a technologically advanced, highly motivated colonizing society can fail to establish a permanent settlement if the environmental window is too short and the social and political obstacles too great. The Norse had all the skills necessary to survive in the North Atlantic. They were master shipbuilders, skilled farmers, and experienced traders, but they could not overcome the twin challenges of a hostile indigenous population and an unreliable climatic foundation. This lesson resonates with the fate of other failed colonial ventures, from the Roanoke colony of 16th century North Carolina to the 19th century Franklin expedition in the Canadian Arctic, and it provides a sobering counterpoint to the narrative of European triumphalism that often accompanies the story of the Age of Exploration. The Vikings were the first, but they were not the last, to be defeated by the Americas, and their failure at Vinland foreshadows the centuries of struggle, adaptation, and conflict that would define the subsequent history of European colonization. The turf walls of aux Meadows, slowly eroding into the Newfoundland soil, are a monument to a dream that the climate both enabled and denied, a poignant reminder that human ambition is always at the mercy of the natural world. The butternut and grape evidence from aux Meadows is the key that unlocks the door to the true geographical extent of the Vinland voyages, and the scientific detective work behind these botanical finds is a story of its own. The butternut shells and the worked butternut burrow were recovered from the floor of Hall C and from the midden area during Anne Stine Ingstad's excavation, and they were initially identified by botanists at the Canadian National Museum. Butternut, Juglans cinerea, is a medium-sized hardwood tree whose natural range is strictly limited to the eastern deciduous forest biome of North America, extending from southern Ontario and Quebec down through New England and into the southern Appalachians, with its northern limit at approximately 46 degrees north latitude. The tree does not grow on the island of Newfoundland, and the nearest natural stands are in the Miramichi River Valley of New Brunswick, about 400 kilometers southwest of aux Meadows. The presence of butternut shells and wood at a Norse site therefore constitutes irrefutable evidence that the inhabitants of aux Meadows either made a long-distance voyage to the Miramichi region and brought back the nuts and wood, or acquired them through trade with indigenous groups who had brought them from the south. The most parsimonious explanation is that the Norse themselves sailed into the Gulf of St. Lawrence and explored the forested shores of what is now New Brunswick, where they would have encountered a rich mixed woodland environment teeming with butternut, wild grape, and white oak, precisely the type of landscape that the sagas describe as Vinland. The butternut burl, which is a dense, contorted growth on a tree trunk prized by woodcarvers, shows knife marks that indicate it was being intentionally shaped, perhaps into a bowl or a cup, suggesting that the Norse were not merely collecting botanical specimens but were actively using the exotic materials they found. The wild grape hypothesis, which was the cornerstone of the Vinland saga narrative and the source of the name itself, has been similarly validated by a combination of paleobotany and historical ecology. The riverbank grape, Vitis riparia, is a hardy species that today grows along the shores of the St. Lawrence River and its tributaries, as well as in the river valleys of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Its distribution is limited by winter minimum temperatures, and during the medieval warm period its range likely extended further north, possibly into the Gaspé Peninsula and the southern shore of the St. Lawrence Gulf. The presence of grape pollen in peat cores taken from the Great Northern Peninsula of Newfoundland, dated to the 11th century, provides direct evidence that grapes were growing at least that far north at the time of the Norse visits. The saga's description of Turkar finding grapes and vines, and the Norse loading their ships with grapes and timber, can thus be reconciled with the environmental reality. The grapes were likely found on the south-facing slopes of the Gulf of St. Lawrence coast, a few days' sail from aux Meadows, and the memory of that discovery was attached to the name Vinland, which originally meant wineland, but could also mean pasture land, a dual meaning that perfectly captures the mixed agrarian and viticultural character of the region. The butternut and grape trail, taken together, maps out a southern exploration corridor that stretched from the northern tip of Newfoundland to the shores of the Miramichi, a distance of some 600 kilometers, and it demonstrates that the Norse were actively scouting the entire region, not just clinging to a single beachhead. The implications of the butternut grape evidence for the size and duration of the Vinland exploration are substantial. If the Norse were making regular voyages from aux Meadows to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, they would have needed to establish a secure anchorage and perhaps a temporary camp in the south of Vinland South that has not yet been discovered. The saga description of Hop, the tidal lagoon where the Norse encountered the Skrælings and traded cloth for furs, is an excellent candidate for such a location, and the butternut grape corridor points directly to the Miramichi Bay, a massive, shallow estuary with extensive salt marshes, abundant wild grapes, and a documented archaeological record of Mi'kmaq occupation going back millennia. The Miramichi region is also rich in butternut trees, and the river system provides a natural highway for canoe travel deep into the interior, where the Norse might have encountered indigenous groups engaged in long-distance trade. The distance from aux Meadows to the mouth of the Miramichi River is approximately 550 nautical miles, a voyage of 4 to 5 days in an hour, and the prevailing southwesterly winds in summer would have made the return journey relatively easy. The presence of butternut shells at the base camp indicates that multiple trips to the south were made, and the careful curation of the butternut burl as a piece of craft would suggest that the Norse intended to bring these exotic materials back to Greenland as evidence of the richness of the land they had discovered. The butternut is, in effect, the smoking gun of the Vinland voyages, an object that tells a detailed story of geographic range, economic intent, and cultural encounter. The search for the Hop of the Sagas and the southern Vinland camps is now one of the most active areas of Norse North American archaeology, and the Miramichi Bay and Baie des Chiles regions are at the top of the target list. Teams of archaeologists from the University of New Brunswick and Parks Canada have begun systematic surveys of the raised beaches and river terraces in these areas, using LiDAR to identify potential house platforms and ground-penetrating radar to detect subsurface anomalies. The acidic soils of the region, however, are notoriously destructive of organic materials, and any Norse presence would likely be represented only by the most durable artifacts, iron slag, rivets, and charcoal. The discovery of a single Norse iron nail in a securely dated 11th century context would be enough to transform the butternut grape hypothesis from a strong inference into an archaeological fact. Until such a discovery is made, The butternut shells and the grape pollen remain the best physical evidence for the southern extent of the Vinland voyages, and they stand as a testament to the extraordinary breadth of the Norse exploration. The fact that a few charred nuts and a piece of carved wood, recovered from a muddy floor in a remote Newfoundland cove, can reconstruct a 600-kilometer exploration corridor 1,000 years later is a powerful illustration of the potential of archaeobotany to rewrite history. The Vinland story, far from being fully told, is still unfolding, and the forests of New Brunswick may yet hold the key to the next chapter. Placing aux Meadows in the broader context of global exploration history requires comparing the Norse achievement with other pre-modern transoceanic voyages and assessing why the Vinland colony failed while other colonial enterprises succeeded. The Norse crossing of the North Atlantic in the years around 1000 AD was, by any measure, one of the great feats of human seamanship, comparable to the Polynesian settlement of the Pacific Islands, which occurred over a period of several thousand years and involved voyages of up to 3,000 kilometers in double-hulled canoes. Both the Norse and the Polynesians used open boats, relied on celestial and environmental navigation, and transported complete human ecosystems, plants, animals, and people, to new lands. The crucial difference was that the Polynesians encountered unoccupied islands, such as Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand, where they were able to establish permanent colonies without immediate competition from other human groups. The Norse in Vinland, by contrast, arrived on a continent that was already inhabited by resilient, well-adapted indigenous populations who had no intention of ceding their territory. The failure of Vinland was not a failure of nautical skill but a failure of the colonial model when confronted with an inhabited land. This same pattern, technological superiority defeated by indigenous resistance, and the sheer distance from the homeland, would recur multiple times in the subsequent European colonization of the Americas, most notably with the Roanoke colony, the first French colonies in Florida, and the early English settlements in Newfoundland, all of which struggled or failed in their initial decades. The Vinland Saga, in this light, is the prototype of the American colonial story, a story of ambition, conflict, and retreat that would be repeated on a much larger scale over the following 500 years. The question of why Columbus succeeded in establishing a permanent link between the Old World and the New while Leif Erikson failed is central to understanding the Vinland story. Columbus's 1492 voyage was backed by the unified Kingdom of Spain, with its vast financial and military resources, and his ships were armed with cannon and carried a crew of professional soldiers. More importantly, Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, where the Taino population had no immunity to Old World diseases and was devastated by epidemics that facilitated Spanish conquest. The Norse of the 11th century had none of these advantages. Their home base in Greenland was a marginal colony of a few thousand people, not a nation-state with a treasury, and their ships carried no firearms, only iron weapons that were superior to stone but not decisively so against a determined enemy. The indigenous peoples of Vinland were not isolated islanders but part of a continent-wide population with experience in warfare and long-distance trade, and they did not succumb to any Norse-born diseases, likely because the Norse, coming from a cold, sparsely populated environment, were not carrying the acute infectious diseases that later devastated the Americas. The failure of Vinland was thus overdetermined, a small, under-resourced expedition facing a large, healthy indigenous population at the end of a long, dangerous supply line. The comparison between Vinland and the Spanish conquest highlights the contingency of colonial success and the fact that a difference of 500 years in technology, epidemiology, and political organization made all the difference. aux Meadows, as the archaeological proof of the first attempt, forces us to rethink the narrative of European dominance and to recognize that the conquest of the Americas was not inevitable. It was the product of a specific historical moment. The Vinland voyages also invite comparison with other early medieval exploration efforts, such as the Arab and Persian voyages across the Indian Ocean to East Africa and China, the Chinese voyages of Xing He in the 15th century, and the possible pre-Columbian transatlantic crossings by Irish monks, Phoenicians, or West African sailors. Most of these claims remain unproven or are regarded as speculative, but the Vinland case is unique in having both a coherent textual tradition and indisputable archaeological proof. The Irish Imrama, or voyage tales, speak of a land called Tir na Nog, or High Brazil, in the Western Ocean, and some scholars have speculated that Irish monks, known as the Paper, may have reached Iceland and possibly points further west before the Norse. The medieval Icelandic sources themselves state that when the Norse first arrived in Iceland, they found Irish monks living there, though no archaeological trace of them has been confirmed. The possibility of pre-Norse transatlantic contact by other cultures adds a layer of mystery to the Vinland story, but it also underscores the fact that the Norse were part of a larger human pattern of ocean exploration that spans millennia and multiple civilizations. The discovery of aux Meadows validated the concept that the Atlantic was not a barrier but a highway, and it opened the door to a more pluralistic and globally connected vision of pre-modern history. The legacy of aux Meadows in the history of science is also significant, because it represents the triumph of interdisciplinary research and the power of the human-centric approach to historical inquiry. The discovery was not made by a remote sensing satellite or a deep-sea submersible. It was made by an elderly Norwegian explorer who walked the coast, talked to fishermen, and trusted the words of medieval storytellers. It is a reminder that the human past is often best revealed by a combination of textual scholarship, local knowledge, and careful digging, not by grand technological solutions alone. The Vinland story, as a chapter in the history of archaeology, is a testament to the value of the individual researcher's passion and persistence, qualities that are as important in the age of digital humanities as they were in the 1960s. The site itself, now managed by Parks Canada and visited by tens of thousands of people each year, continues to inspire new generations of archaeologists, historians, and storytellers to look beyond the established canons and to ask whether other myths might contain a core of truth waiting to be unearthed. As we come to the end of our journey through the story of aux Meadows, it is time to synthesize the many threads we have explored and to reflect on what this remarkable place means for our understanding of history. We have walked the windswept terrace on the tip of Newfoundland's Great Northern Peninsula, where Helge and Anne Stine Ingstad uncovered the turf walls of a 1,000-year-old Norse settlement. We have examined the evidence in meticulous detail, the iron rivets and slag from the smithy that proved the first metalworking in North America north of Mexico, the soapstone spindle whorl that speaks of the presence of women, the butternut shells that trace a voyage to the forests of New Brunswick, and the tree rings that pin the occupation to the exact year 1021 AD. We have delved into the Icelandic sagas, the medieval texts that preserve the memory of Vinland through centuries of oral tradition, and we have seen how the archaeological record confirms their core narrative, while enriching it with the tangible reality of daily life. We have considered the wider context of Norse expansion, the environmental conditions that made the voyages possible, and the indigenous peoples who met the strangers on their shores and ultimately compelled their retreat. What emerges from this synthesis is not a simple tale of discovery and triumph but a complex, deeply human story of ambition, adaptation, conflict, and failure that prefigures the entire subsequent history of European contact with the Americas. The significance of aux Meadows extends far beyond the academic world of archaeology. It challenges the foundational myths of the modern nation-states of the Americas by demonstrating that the first transatlantic contact occurred half a millennium before Columbus, and that it was carried out by a people who themselves lived at the margins of Europe. It reminds us that the history of the Atlantic world is not a single story but a tapestry woven from many voyages, many encounters, and many silenced voices. The indigenous Skraelings of the Sagas, the Beothuk and Mi'kmaq and Dorset and Thule, are not peripheral characters in a European epic. They are the original inhabitants and defenders of the land, whose presence decisively shaped the outcome of the Norse venture. The story of Vinland, told in its full complexity, is a story that belongs to all the peoples of the North Atlantic, to the Icelanders who wrote the sagas, to the Norwegians who excavated the site, to the Canadians who protect it, and to the indigenous communities whose ancestors witnessed the strange ships and the pale strangers. It is a story of crossing and collision that continues to resonate in a world still grappling with the legacies of colonialism, and the challenge of building a shared history from multiple perspectives. In this sense, aux Meadows is not just an archaeological site, it is a place of memory and reconciliation, where the past is constantly renegotiated in the light of the present. We hope that this deep dive into the archaeology of Vinland has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to learn more about the many untold stories of our shared history. If you found this exploration valuable, please take a moment to hit the like button, because your engagement helps us bring more in-depth documentaries to a wider audience. Subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode of Stories of Our History. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. Which part of the Vinland story surprised you the most? And if you have a friend who is fascinated by Vikings or early American history, share this video with them and start a conversation. Every like, comment, and share makes a real difference in supporting the research and production that goes into these documentaries, and we are deeply grateful for your support. Our next episode will take us to another corner of the past where history and archaeology collide, so stay tuned and keep exploring. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video.